This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate first part of What If Naruto and Fem-Sasuke Travel Back in Time. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
Around the same time that I was gasping for air in a bed that I had outgrown, I woke up to the sound of an alarm clock that I had broken years earlier. As I took in the details of my room that the pre-dawn light permitted, my untrained eyes darted back and forth. When it went silent, I grunted too loudly and finally settled on the clock, reaching out with an arm too short to press the snooze button. I struggled to breathe while staring up at my ceiling, and it took me several minutes to regain my sanity. That old bastard was the real deal, I uttered in a tone of innocent awe. I raised my hands to examine the areas that should have been scarred and calloused, but instead I saw smooth skin. I chuckled. As I gripped my head and processed my response to the old sage's offer, it began as a high-pitched giggle that was all too appropriate for my current body and then turned into hysterical peals. With a cry of, "All right," I threw myself out of bed and crashed to the ground. With a crazy smile, I wiped the tears from my eyes. Time to save the world. I can plainly see with my eyes. The chakra of Asura is clinging to you. After a little personal grooming and a quick check of the calendar, and a much longer walk around the village, I was on my way to the academy gates. I waved to a passing sensei while nibbling on a sweet bun, and he gave me a suspicious look before moving on. Oh well. They would change their minds. I muttered to myself, it's been a while since I've pranked this place, as I made my way to what I vaguely remembered to be my class down deserted hallways. I'll have to fix that before I graduate. A few minutes later, blind luck brought me to the right door, and I slid it open before the ecstatic butterflies in my chest could make me reconsider. I stared back at the class as they turned to face me as a group, taking in the sight of everyone who had graduated with me so long ago. People who were incalculably valuable to me. I had allowed people to be harmed and killed. After I made eye contact with the person I had let go, I was immobilized. God, I nearly forgot her previous appearance. You have a peculiar sense of foolishness that sets you apart from your predecessors, and that is what has created this alternative possibility. Iruka said, "Naruto," and I blinked as I glanced up at another individual I had let down. "Hey sensei," I said, forcing a smile and taking another morsel of food from the bag I had purchased. "Sweet roll." Some of them laughed. Iruka didn't find it funny. Flatly, "You're late," he said. "Ah, sorry." He gave a headshake. "Just sit down, and don't make a mess." After giving my sweet bun a salute, I shoved it into my mouth while looking around the room for any vacant seats. There was only one spot available, and the girl sitting next to it was still looking at me, which shocked and delighted me at the same time. Presumably challenging me to sit beside her. My mouth quirked. That wouldn't work now. Hoping over Shikamaru's sleeping head to the table on the other side of the stairs, I jumped from the doorway to the row of desks 3 levels down, turning to avoid smashing Choji's bag of chips. After a graceful leapfrog over a furious Kiba, I thumped noisily into my seat. In front of my completely unimpressed classmate. "Friend. Love. Friend." I placed my bag of goodies on the table and ducked my head just in time to avoid Iruka's thrown eraser. Her midnight black eyes, as sharp as ever, lifted an eyebrow. I smiled like Uzumaki and pointed to the bag. "Breakfast. Sasuke. What would you like to do, Naruto? What would you look for when this battle is over? Sincerely and honestly, I would like to know what you think." After a series of morning classes, lunchtime finally arrived. After he finished chewing me out, Iruka called me down for a lecture on being on time and the upcoming Genin exams at the end of the week. This brought back so many happy memories that I didn't mind giving him his sweet bun. I bragged, "Don't worry, Iruka Sensei," as he examined the morsel carefully. "I'll crush this test no problem." He ruffled my hair and grinned wryly. "I really do hope so." I was rushing out to the academy yard a moment later, observing the dispersed clusters of aspiring shinobi. The urge to run over and say hello, "How are you? I'm so glad you're safe. I love you all so much, holy shit," was evoked by every familiar face. Unfortunately, the girl who wasn't in the yard called to me more than anyone else. Sakura blinked in surprise as I swept past her group of friends after spotting me running over to them and flinching in anticipation of my customary advances. The projectile grounds was my first thought. I recall that during our time at the academy, Sasuke was completely focused on honing all of her intricate Uchiha Kunai techniques. No success. Taking into account the deserted training area, I folded my arms. I thought, another challenge, Sasuke? Well, no, most likely, she was simply having lunch somewhere else. Still, I was still up to the task of finding her despite that. Over the years, I'd gotten pretty good at that. I discovered her on the roof, holding a loose rice ball in her hand while gazing up at the Hokage mountain. As I took a seat next to her, I was once again subjected to her scrutiny. I grinned. Hey. She averted her gaze and blinked. Hello. Hiding from your admirers again? She grinned, and despite myself, I couldn't help but be attracted to the way her lips curled. Not exactly. I looked up at the Hokage mountain and asked, what's on your mind? But I hadn't defiled it today. That brought back memories, didn't it? I leaned back on my hands and snorted. Whatever, bastard. Idiot. Sasuke ignored me, just as she had ignored everyone else in the past, and we fell silent. Between stealthy looks at her lips, lashes, and those damned gorgeous eyes, I vowed to fix that as soon as possible. I let out a slow breath. I told myself it wasn't my Sasuke. Not entirely. Parts of her that made my heart race and my teeth grind had been lost in the migration, and if I had anything to say about it, those parts of her would never return. The pain it would cause her was not worth the life that had molded the girl I vowed never to forgive for constantly beating me to the ground during our sparring sessions into the woman I couldn't help but love. She and all the other people I cared about. As a result, I would now need to keep my word and fulfill my obligation to the elderly wise man. I would have to make amends and transform the person I loved in the process. Out of the corner of my eye, I took another chance look at her. She was still a child, but she was still beautiful. And I had years on her, regardless of what I might like to tell myself. I couldn't just push years worth of memories and emotions on her right now. It would not be equitable, ultimately, not to either of us. It was painful. God, it hurt so much to have her back at last, sitting next to me, without knowing how to tell her. It was more painful than the lightning she had struck my chest with the day she left. Suddenly, I was jolted out of my internal struggle by my own rumbling stomach. My late breakfast apparently wasn't sufficient. After all, I ought to have visited that beef stand. Here. I looked down at the unopened rice ball that the object of my struggle had pushed under my nose and blinked. Oh. I questioned, you sure? She nodded, and the intensity of my smile caused my eyes to squint. Thanks. She shrugged, then resumed her disregard for me. Even so, the quiet between us as she thought about the mountains and I ate her lunch wasn't as tense as it might have been. And that was sufficient for now. I was afraid that she would never be the woman I loved again because she had changed. But in the end, I had made a decision that affected everyone who had been harmed by my errors, not just her. I had promised myself that I would do whatever it took to clean up this mess before it could happen. To myself, my friends, and the sage. Furthermore, Uzumaki Naruto never broke his word. I see. So that's your response. Why couldn't I simply speak with him? I gazed at the Hokage mountain, a monument to a village that, until very recently, I would have been happy to drown in seas of black fire. In comparison to the otherworldly clarity I had become used to over the years, I stared with eyes that could no longer see clearly. I used legs that had lost their definition and, a traitorous part of me feared, their appeal to balance myself on the roof. An annoying boy with wild eyes and a smile that made my breath catch in my throat every time I saw it sat barely 2 feet away from me, eating the lunch I had thrown together in a daze earlier that morning. Like right now. Why couldn't I simply speak with him? Sasuke. What do you wish to accomplish? What do you want to get out of this battle? The stakes were too high. Too much to allow to rest on a thoughtless slight between me and the man who had taken up residence in my heart alone. Not when he had so little knowledge of who I was now and what remarks were meant to bite and what to sting. But this was Naruto, after all. I couldn't help but smile. How long had he let a little pessimism hold him back? He asked, "What's so funny?" And that little challenging glint in his eye when he said it was the one thing about him that I hoped would never change. Those eyes have provoked me into many foolish actions. Some pose a greater threat to the world than others. I never missed a beat. Your grades, I uttered, using words I knew well. He pushed a finger into my face in a fit of rage. He slammed the remainder of my rice ball into his mouth and swallowed it without chewing in his outrage. Watch it, bastard, he yelled. Or I'll kick your ass. In front of all the instructors, on exam day. I looked at the finger he still had on the tip of my nose and ignored his bluster. Despite my best efforts, a memory that had been ingrained in my mind by my former eyes suddenly became the most important thing on my mind. Pointing at a similar nose with a similar finger. Similar lips being licked by a similar tongue. Ghosting across similarly tanned skin as similarly hot breath. That finger of yours is going to fall off, fool. The digit vanished as quickly as it appeared, and Naruto turned his head away from me while coughing ferociously. Most likely choking on the rice clump he had attempted to swallow whole. I gave an eye roll. It served as a kind of sobering reminder. This Naruto was no longer entirely mine. I wanted to jam my tongue down his throat and beat his cocky, stupid face in, but the Naruto I knew had been lost to the migration. I mostly just wanted to beat the Naruto I remembered from the academy. If I wanted to avoid doing the things that had caused so many issues the first time, it would be hard to get my Naruto back. It's impossible, some would argue. I didn't intend to duplicate the path he had taken as a result of my actions, so I was left here with this boy who still didn't understand the distinction between the kunai in his pants and the one in his weapon pouch. I was unable to have it both ways. If I attempted to pick up where we left things, we would both be disappointed. Somewhere in the academy below us, I heard a bell ring, so I inclined my head. Lunch would be over then. I made my choice after taking one final glance at the Yondaime Hokage's eerily familiar face and Hokage Mountain. I just intended to speak with him. Naruto, I said. He gave me his whole attention while pausing to brush off the bits of rice that had gotten all over him. Aching to bunch in his shirt and pull him in, to fist in his hair and pull him even closer, my fingers twitched, wanting to put themselves around his throat and shake him back and forth. Still hungry? I inquired in a slightly strained tone. His eyes became cloudy for a long beat as he pursed his lips. I could eat, yeah. I got to my feet smoothly and cocked my head toward the distant market district. Then hurry up. Naruto called out, what? Hey, we've still got class, but I had already started to run through the trees in the direction of the afternoon food vendors. As he followed me, he muttered to himself, wait, why'd I care we still have class? Light and breathy, a strange sound danced past my lips and up my throat. Not a laugh, as Uchiha Sasuke didn't laugh, but he also didn't giggle. I hadn't had anything to laugh about in a very long time, however. It was pleasant. I'd like to know what you genuinely think. I took him to a well-known street corner, and when he happened to spot his favorite ramen shop and pulled me inside, I gave in with as much good humor as was reasonable. We took the middle two seats, and I deliberately avoided the middle-aged woman who was glaring at my teammate, lover, friend, and lover. Oi, Tucci, called Naruto. Fire up the extra burners. It's time for me to catch up. Out of the back room came laughter. What do you mean catch up? You were here last night. A moment later, a pretty young lady with a lively smile and chestnut brown hair appeared holding a pen and notepad. When Naruto saw her, his face brightened. She said, what can I do for you, Naruto-kun, 2 of my usual to start, and a small order of miso while I wait. And tell the old man not to skimp on the fish cakes this time. An old man shouted from the back, I never skimp on the fish cakes, you punk. While writing down his order and looking expectantly at me, the waitress burst out laughing. Medium shrimp, was my curt response. She disappeared into the back after nodding and writing a brief note on her pad. Thanks Ayame. Naruto exclaimed as he called for her, wearing a modest, stupid smile. I squinted. Ayame never appealed to me. About a quarter of the way through my bowl, Naruto's first usual arrived, followed by my shrimp ramen and his miso. Every time I witnessed it, I couldn't help but stare in disbelief at the enormous bowl with the word Uzumaki printed around the base in blood-red kanji. Naturally, Naruto got right into it. He triumphantly threw his chopsticks into his second empty bowl and exclaimed, ah, perfect. I shook my head and raised my own bowl to finish the broth. He was staring at me when I put it down again. I arched my brow. Yes. He scratched the back of his neck, and I realized how much I had missed that shy gesture. Nothing. It's just, I thought you didn't like ramen. I pointed out that you didn't give me much of a choice, even though my plan had been incredibly dishonest from the beginning. He flinched. With a smile on his face, he did it for me before I could brush off his worry. Right, yeah. Sorry, that wasn't good of me, was it? I know, I'll take you out to lunch tomorrow, your choice. I concealed my smile by folding my fingers in front of my face. Who says I want to eat with you 2 days in a row? He pressed a thumb to his chest instead of accepting the bait. Uzumaki Naruto says. I blinked, briefly mesmerized by his zeal, and then disregarded him. HN. Somewhere deep inside the hollow little heart he'd forced himself into, I was afraid that he would never be the man I loved against all my willed wishes again. Ultimately, though, I had made a decision. I wanted to make amends for the one wrong I sincerely regretted, so I would return to this village with all its unpleasant memories. I was going to have my cake and eat it all, regardless of time or space. Goddamn him, I would make him the man I loved even though he wasn't the one I loved now, in one way or another. Nothing less would satisfy the pride of Uchiha. That's your response, then. I get it. A tree was the first thing created. A single seed was sown on the edge of creation, where the dawn of everything flowed and the dusk of nothing ebbed. Life, chakra, and conscious existence in all of nature grew from this seed. A tree grew from this seed. The tree's roots spread out in all directions, digging and bringing forth life that fed the tree and, consequently, creation. Under the surface of existence, life emerged from its roots, creating an element into which the tree's roots could initially burrow: earth. The second element was created by the tree drawing more life from its roots: water. By drawing more energy to create life above, its leaves were able to bask above the surface of creation and create an element in which to bask: fire. Its seeds spread life to every part of the world as they drifted far and wide, creating an element on which the seeds could float: wind. The tree had one last task to complete after establishing the conditions for existence. It created an element for the beating hearts of nature by igniting all the life it had created with a single, fiery shock: lightning. After creation, the tree gave rise to all forms of life. Above all, things moved away in search of space to exist. Birds flew in search of various nests, and fruit and pollen from smaller trees drifted away in the grip of the weather. The tree was the source of all life, and life emanated from it. Until a fool came back one day. The tree was unsure of how to respond when the speck of life moved backward to its beginning instead of forward to its end. Therefore, it didn't. The idiot did not understand why they felt a connection to the rest of creation after seeing the tree. The foolish person, helpless, asked the tree why it was there. The tree now knew how to respond, and it gave the idiot the way to their solution: an adventure. A quest for solutions that would start and finish with the existence of the idiot and diverge into other solutions as it went. The fool could only comprehend the tree once they had a better understanding of themselves. The speck of existence that had, for the first time, returned to its creation sensed this and, since it had no other way, set out once more to find itself. The fool was there at the beginning. I said, "You can't ignore me forever, you know," to the shadows outside the gates. Only a few feet from them, I sat with water sloshing around my waist, tainted by the negative emotions of both myself and my prisoner. The sewer was exactly as I had remembered it, as though Kurama and I had never agreed to cooperate. The healthy white light that had punctuated our new friendship had disappeared. How come he refused to speak to me? I clenched my fists in my lap and sighed. The loss of my friends as I knew them was something I had anticipated. I had braced myself for Sasuke's death. Making that decision and letting go of the ties that had come to define me had killed me. At the very least, I owed them that, and I had done it because I knew I could improve their lives. However, for some reason, I had anticipated traveling with at least one companion. Monster among monsters, I peered intently into the cage containing the Kyuubi. Back then, we had made a decision in the middle of a battle that neither a man nor a Biju could win by themselves. We had trusted each other in ways that had never been considered, much less tried. Until there was only a single, glistening pool of life that was far beyond the capacity of either of our individual selves. Our chakrasha, the very energies of our beings, had collided, memories, emotions, and strength leaking into one another. At that point, we were more than just friends. We were one and the same, an authentic Jinchuriki. That being said, how could he have been abandoned? I yelled, "Say something," since I was at a loss for words. "Talk to me, you stupid fox." Nothing. The Biju's silence was so absolute that the seal might as well have been holding back air. I ignored the disgusting water that stuck to my cheeks and moaned as I buried my face in my hands. I uttered the words, "I think. I get it," with such reluctance that I hardly heard myself. Asura, the son of that old sage, only selected me to be his descendant, not the two of us. You remained silent when I made my decision because of this, because it was mine, even though it should have been ours. I looked up through the spaces between my fingers and spoke louder. I apologize for my choice, which I made without thinking about how it would affect our relationship. I apologize, Kurama, I said, dropping my hands. I'm sorry I left you behind. That was the cause. Refusing to be intimidated, I slid back with the current, finding my feet and looking up at my best friend. The water on the floor smashed into my chest, pushed out of the cage by an amazing force, and a moment later the sewer shook from the force of the Biju's collision against the bars. He was angry. His eyes, which were menacing even in tender moments, had been smothered by crimson rage, and there was not even a trace of his slitted pupils in their depths. His clawed hands shook against the unforgiving bars, making their intentions clear. His tails, which were the source of the fierce currents, whipped behind him, each one powerful enough to split mountains and part oceans on its own. You have no right to that name, human, he growled, really growling the word. I ignored how the water suddenly boiled, hissed, and tore at my clothes and exposed skin, gritting my teeth against his wrath. If this was the case, I would simply have to re-establish our bond, just like everyone else, and would have to beat sense into his big furry head, just like I had done the last time. And now was the ideal moment to begin. The only right belongs to me. Over the echoes of his blow to the seal, I roared. In all the centuries of memories he had shared with me, Kurama had never once valued meekness. This seal is the reason. This seal puts your life in my hands, and my life in yours, I said, clutching my shirt, which had been partially consumed by the waters that Kurama's emotions had made so corrosive, and ripping it off in one swift motion. I slapped my stomach, causing it to come alive with the black ink of my father's seal. We're all the same thanks to this seal. You have my name, and I have yours. Never assume that Jiraiya's apprentice had not inherited his dramatic flair. I gave him a cheeky smile and said, "You are deranged," but it was too late for him. I had already come to terms with the loss of another friend and made a commitment to earn a new one. Which means you were deranged. He punctuated his last sentence by slamming all 9 of his tails into the bars so forcefully that I was knocked off my feet and returned to the real world. Enough, you will leave. Using my body as a medium, Kurama and I had been able to move back and forth between reality and the housings of my soul at will, but now we were back to square one there as well. I blinked and closed my eyes a moment later, waiting for the nausea caused by the transition to pass. I mumbled, "Ain't this a bitch," as I rubbed my sore eyelids and took another chance to glance around the brightly lit clearing. And discovered that more than a dozen stone statues of the large man himself were all around me. What the devil? I turned to see a single, sheepish clone made of flesh rather than stone. Hey boss," my own voice said behind me. "Some stuff happened while you were out." "I just instructed you all to try out some different methods," I said, unable to believe it. "Yes, I am aware. Since none of our other strategies were effective and Naruto, who was testing out Sage Mode, was able to gather some nature chakra before he messed up, we decided to give it a try as well." What a bunch of fools, I thought. "So you managed to pull it off since you're still alive?" My final clone shook his head when I asked, barely letting myself hope. "We didn't get any feedback from the others turning to stone," he said, eyeing the statues with an uneasy expression on his whiskered face. "I figured you'd want someone around to explain, so you didn't try it yourself. Don't assume they've passed away." That made me wonder, and I immediately pushed those questions into the back of my mind. From what I'd seen and heard so far, it wasn't enough. I still knew how to do all the different techniques I'd learned in my years as a shinobi, including how to coax the world's chakra into my coils and what made the Rasengan tick. Uruka. Sensei's lectures on the balance between yin and yang, the energies of the mind and body, the heart and the soul, had never made as much sense to me as they did at this moment. I knew what I needed to do, but my body wasn't ready, even though my mind was ready. I told myself, "Looks like I've got some training ahead of me," and he grinned wildly in response. "Is it time to go wild?" I nodded and created the seal for the one method that had not failed me when he asked. "Oh yeah." As dozens of people talked about a little while I sat in the middle of a perfect storm of Uzumaki Naruto, glaring at a balloon that would not pop, I suddenly questioned whether transmigration had been the right decision. My options were limited from the Rasengan and its various variations to the exercises Kakashi Sensei had taught me years ago, and when it came down to it, I couldn't do much with Kakashi Sensei's shadow clone trick as I was now. At this point in my life, I had hardly even heard of chakra control, much less understood it. In order to create some sparse edges of wind, I had clones running up trees, balancing leaves on their noses, and smashing their chakras together. I told them it was time to get back to the fundamentals. To my right, a clone reached halfway up a tree before, in his excitement, he blasted himself into the ground with too much chakra in his next step, dying in a puff of smoke, and I felt my eyes cross as yet another set of memories pushed their way into my mind. My memories must have been worth something, and I was making good progress for only a few hours of work, definitely more than the first time I had learned these things. Unfortunately, the more we trained, the more we learned, and the more we learned, the more I had to adjust when one of my clones committed suicide. 100 memories of a few seconds of a fight I could handle blended together, making it easy to discard most of it. However, 100 memories of 100 different training regimens, techniques, and results. Throwing those away would negate the point of training with the stupid bastards in the first place, and ingesting them all gave me a terrible headache. I was good at creating clonisa the best, perhaps. A clone grabbed my balloon out of the air and looked to me for permission to work on it instead of his leaf, so I tossed it aside and rubbed my temples instead, nodding in agreement. It appeared that I would not be receiving the old man's hat anytime soon at this rate. What time is it? For the sake of my aching head, I refused to look up at the sun, so I asked, and a clone in front of me replied. Little after noon, boss. My fingers went cold. Dude. I'm running late for lunch. Iruka, a man I vaguely remembered as one of Naruto's first friends, had showered me with praise while passing over my headband, but I hadn't really paid much attention to him. The Genin exams came and went, and I passed them with roughly the same difficulty as the first time. I had been more focused on keeping an eye on the next student. He had fled from the academy and his mocking classmates, and I had watched him go, tying my own headband around my neck and swallowing down the sour taste in my mouth. But Naruto never explained to me the circumstances behind his failing the Genin exam and then becoming a shinobi anyway, which rather infuriated me as I watched him dart from the examination room with a naked forehead. I could only wait and hope for the best for the time being because I had no idea what he needed to do. Fortunately, he had persevered, and the following day, I discovered him grinning in the seat next to mine, exactly as I had remembered. The teams had also remained the same, which left me feeling very conflicted. I was standing in the Naka shrine now, staring down at the tablet of the Sage of Six Paths, but I couldn't really see it because of two things. First, my eyes weren't strong enough to read all of the text on it, and second, I was facing the third member of my team, with whom I would once more have to spend months of my life. When we were teammates, I didn't like Haruno Sakura, and I didn't like her when we were classmates. After I left Konoha, I hated Haruno Sakura, and she hated me in return. Our relationship had always been tense. She had admired me during our early days as Genin and made every effort to become my friend. When I rejected her advances, she would focus on our other teammate and take pleasure in making fun of my superiority. I didn't give a damn about either of them at the time, but looking back, it had only made me despise her more. Sakura had been reduced to a supporting role as Naruto and I had become increasingly interested in each other as Revulsa, although neither of us had been prepared to acknowledge this at the time, and it was at this point that her admiration had given way to resentment because she had assumed that I would support her over Naruto. This was only strengthened by my desertion, which, for a variety of reasons, had not occurred to me at the time as something worth considering, and I would have been content to keep it that way. But after years apart, completely against our wills, Naruto and I started to rekindle our attraction to one another. Our rivalry roared back to life, and gradually, something else developed between us, something I had never known I wanted until I felt the weight of his own desires in the glances he would give me in between blows, heard the way that blonde moron's voice had changed, and saw how he had grown. Then, as usual, Haruno fucking Sakura chose to venture where no one wanted her. With one tomo spinning in each of my blood-red eyes, I turned away from the ancient tablet of my clan. Of all the skills I had learned throughout my life, the only ones I had kept after my transmigration were a few low-level techniques and the first stage of my Kekkei Genkei. The latter was only because I already had it at this point in my life and had simply not realized it. I dismissed my Sharingan and my thoughts about useless pink women as I stalked out of the shrine. Kakashi's bell test was tomorrow, and even though I could have easily defeated him prior to my migration, I had changed as a shinobi, and I would need a very different plan if I wanted to win a bell. Since I was aware of the absurd lesson he was attempting to impart, it wouldn't matter if I didn't pass. I still wanted to, though. As I strolled through the Uchiha district, memories and feelings racing through my mind, I discovered a lot of information about my clan and its massacre after leaving Konoha, nearly all of which contradicted what I had previously believed to be true. I was certain now that I knew the truth, but I didn't want to face it yet, so I would concentrate on things that didn't hurt as much for the time being. It was going to be a tough battle, no matter how I looked at it. I found myself at my clan's armory, one of the few parts of the district that I had bothered to keep up after the massacre. I entered and looked around at the weapons, armor, and materials inside. I would have to make a lot of decisions because I was at my best when I added ninjutsu to my kenjutsu, which my current level of elemental control would not allow. But if I could convince Naruto to cooperate, if I had the right plan, we had a chance, a slim one, perhaps, but I hadn't earned my flee on sight ranking for nothing, and I'd seen Naruto realize that potential, and he could become just as strong with the right guidance. Every step of the way, I had been pretty close to him. I curled my lips and said, "We'll just need to get creative." Ibu Kanko, the elite Jonin of Iwagakure, waited for death while crouching in a mountainside shadow and holding his hands in the last seal of his trademark reconnaissance method. "Senpei," rookie Jonin Izia muttered, with a sense of urgency that, in any other circumstance, would have seemed inappropriate for a group of Iwa's finest and brightest. "They're coming this way," she said. "Shall we?" "Stop." The smaller shinobi was cuffed over the head by Kanko's second. In. Command, who hissed, "We depart as soon as the commander gives the order, and no earlier. Don't interfere with his focus." The rest of their squadron echoed the murmurs of agreement, and the rookie did nothing but look uneasily up at the sky in the face of such overwhelming opposition. The Iwa team held their breath as an impact shook the ground beneath them hundreds of feet up the mountain. A moment later, an arc of screaming blue light ripped through the air above them. The only thing preventing them from making a hasty retreat was the possibility of tripping again, this time into the symbolic fire, after they had tripped over their own feet on their way home after a successful mission. Kenko's team was well aware that the two monsters fighting above them were not to be taken lightly. The briefing had not made much sense to Kenko at the time. All he had learned was that, for a brief period of time, his preferred camouflage technique would hold against the all-seeing juggernaut. Konoha's Toad Sage, a shinobi of unparalleled strength, was said to perceive his surroundings by means of his surroundings, using the perception of the world around him to achieve a near sensor-like ability of skill in tracking his enemies. Whereas the Toad Sage relied on the world to be his eyes, the Uchiha's coveted bloodline allowed her eyes to be her world. Genjutsu, stealth, and deception of any kind were stripped bare by her fully matured Sharingan. His opponent, Konoha's last Uchiha, and their greatest defector to date, was a woman who could and had often destroyed scores of Iwa squads simply for being at what she considered to be the wrong place at the wrong time. Kenko had little choice but to hope the Toad Sage would keep her undivided attention long enough for his team to find an opening because his technique would not withstand her scrutiny for very long. "Fuck it," above them, a harsh voice bellowed, "I don't have time for you today. Sasuke, leave me alone." As if it weren't terrible enough that the Toad Sage possessed a strange and potent form of alternative chakra, he had chosen the creation of Iwa's most despised shinobi as his signature attack. Above them, a strange sound, akin to 100 blades being sharpened on 100 spinning stones, revved into life, causing several members of their squad, including Kenko, to shudder reflexively. The Iwa shinobi were annoyed by the distinctive sounds of the Yondaime Hokage's Rasengan, which were followed a moment later by the sound of thousands and thousands of birds chirping. "No way." With a tense, guttural voice, the Uchiha taunted, "Naruto, you're mine." "Avoid." Kenko clenched his eyes shut and prepared for the reaction as he snapped, speaking for the first time since the beginning of his technique, and his shinobi immediately obeyed. Before the muffled boom of the two techniques clashing shook the mountain above them, raining shards of rock down on the Iwa shinobi, the two legendary shinobi met above them, and a shockwave of chakra slammed into Kenko's technique, propelling him forward from his crouch to his knees. Then the Rasengan exploded, and a blaze of light ripped through the blackness of Kenko's closed eyes, temporarily blinding him, and he heard a few agonized screams as the full force of the Rasengan's last phase of attack struck ill-prepared shinobi. You did not actually have to be struck by the Rasengan to be crippled by it. It struck in phases, each with a greater range than the one before it. This was something that far too few people knew back when the Yellow Flash had ruled. Blinking away patches of light, Kenko gazed up at the suddenly ravaged mountain, a truly monstrous attack, for a truly monstrous shinobi. After a few precious seconds, his vision cleared completely, and Kenko used a sharp hand motion to dispel his technique. Now, the rest of his team promptly followed suit as he grabbed the rookie, Izaya, who was still blind, and fled in a shunshin towards the border. The Toad Sage's notice fell upon him almost before he had taken a single step, and Kenko could feel the way the ground beneath his feet throbbed with the sage's influence, the way the sparse vegetation in the area reported back to its master the sweat on his skin as he brushed past it, and the feeling that the air he breathed was somehow betraying him, whispering to the Toad Sage of his squad's frantic gasps. He had been unaware that the sage also governed the wind. "Hold on!" the Toad Sage shouted, and Kenko felt the world shift around him ever so slightly as the Konoha shinobi drew from its energy. "You can't blow my cover yet. Bunshin no Jutsu Cage. Senpai." As the young shinobi watched the Toad Sage's clones wipe out the sun, Izaya cried out in horror. "Keep going. Die running, or don't die at all," Kenko ordered, pulling Izaya along on another shunshin. "Go." "Ga!" Naruto cried, gripping his hair and throwing his head back in frustration when the Iwa team disappeared into the range of mountains leading to Iwa. "You always do this." Saying, "I do," Sasuke leaned against a gouge she had made in the mountain during their battle. "Outside of the Land of Fire, I can never have a pleasant, uneventful mission where everything goes smoothly and you just mind your own business." Using all of his strength, he kicked a rock, sending it hurtling into the distance. With a nod, she said, "You can't. Half the time, you won't even allow me to kiss you after." "I won't." Her blood-red eyes gleamed with cunning laughter. Konoha's second toad sage kicked the mountain one last grunt and leaned back against it, closing his eyes as if he had finished fighting. But Sasuke could see with great satisfaction how the muscles shifting under his clothes tensed and relaxed intermittently, allowing him to move in any direction at any time. From Sasuke's completely objective perspective, it was an invitation for her to approach him at any time she wanted. After some time, her foolish lover was starting to prove himself as a worthy opponent. I had clones on every major border, decoy toads on the roads to Kumo and Kiri, and I even left all my ramen at home this time, he said, directing her attention from his muscles to the deepening tenor of his voice. In addition to everything I did for the mission. She enjoyed his vivid blue glare as Sasuke grinned down at him. Did you really think that would be enough to distract me? Almost as much as it had pleased her to remove all his barriers, she had been pleased to see that he was becoming more inventive in his ways of avoiding her while on Konoha business. Think's a strong word, he acknowledged, adding, damn it, there's no way I can stealth this anymore. He had hoped for little more than time to start his mission, but it appeared that even that had been too much. Man, but Granny Tsunade was going to kill me. Why would anyone send you on a stealth mission in the first place? Sasuke asked, tilting her head and letting her wild bangs fall across her face. Naruto firmly stated, a great Hokage has to be the best shinobi in the village, in all aspects, and Sasuke thought that he had likely practiced that line. How is that relevant to you? She questioned, and when he gave her a stern look, she gave him a defiant smile. He pointed vaguely in Iwa's direction and said, this is serious, with genuine fire in his eyes. I don't know when I'll get another chance at this kind of mission. I didn't even want to get this one from Granny Tsunade. Naruto threw her arm across his chest, letting her hand rest over one shoulder as she leaned in over the other, and he braced himself for another fight as Sasuke fell down in front of him from her elevated perch. It was one of her favorite positions, and it was familiar. Well then, na.ru.to, she whispered softly, stealing an additional inch of space between them to punctuate each syllable of his name. It seems we'll have to get. She said, her face still pleasingly flushed from their altercation, her breath hot against his skin. Creative. The fabled toad sage of Konoha swallowed hard. I think it was funny to see how much I detested standing still from the outside. It's part of being a shinobi, after all, and I had built my entire life around the idea of shinobi. From the time the Sandame told my 5-year-old brat that you couldn't be a Hokage without first being a shinobi, it had become the cornerstone on which I built my dreams. By the time I passed away, Uzumaki Naruto and shinobi might as well have been synonymous. If anyone in the world could still think of one without the other, I didn't know them. Gods help me, though, I detested being motionless. Gara and I hadn't been all that different in that regard. I'd had a better seal, but Shukaku had a hell of a lot less chakra than Kurama. Having an unconscious awareness of oceans upon oceans of demonic chakra seething inside of you, held back by the smallest slip of paper possible, would eventually make anyone upset. I could blame Kurama, if I really wanted to. Not only could I blame my mother, whose genes had passed on the notorious Uzumaki vitality, which couldn't have helped my temperament any more than it helped me control my chakras, but I could also blame my entire clan, Kakashi Sensei included, for arriving late to training every day and leaving me idle for hours on end, Jiraiya for not taking my apprenticeship seriously until the last minute, and so on. I could point the finger at a lot of people, but that wouldn't make it any less my fault, and I always felt sick when I blamed someone else for my own foolishness, and the real reason was pretty straightforward anyhow. I fled because I was afraid. Uzumaki Naruto lived in constant fear, not of the war, not of the demon trapped in my stomach, not even of the murderous woman who seemed determined to kill me one moment and impose herself on me the next, but I would never confess it to anyone but Kurama and myself, and only to him because I hadn't had much of a choice when we'd crashed together into a single being. At least it would have been possible to overcome such fears, perhaps even exciting. But that wasn't it. Rejection was what I feared most, and always feared. For as long as I could remember, I had been plagued by it. First, by the oppressive silence of Konoha's people, who were afraid of a monster that the most powerful leader they had ever encountered had only been able to stall. And then, years later, by my classmates, with whom I was never able to establish a good rapport because I was always too annoying, too foolish, and too Naruto for them to put me before the other people in their lives. The worst of all was with my first real friend, the girl I loved and who meant the world to me. She made me happy and angry at the same time. The departing girl. So I fled. I never remained motionless for more than a second, to the extent that I thrashed, shook, and fell out of bed several times every night. I realized that if I continued to move, I wouldn't have time to reflect on my life or dwell. Uzumaki Naruto didn't dwell. I must have laughed when I realized how funny it must have been for everyone to watch me flee from my troubles while yelling to the sky that I would never give up. It was difficult to tell because it had been raining that day, but I may have cried too. To calm me down for more than a few seconds, it had ultimately taken much more than a firm hand or a soothing voice of a dead god, a bunch of S-rank assholes, and enough pain to lock up every muscle in my body, and not exactly what Iruka Sensei had advised during his meditation lecture, but I've never been a good listener. A soft understanding blossomed from the new mark on my forehead and engulfed the entire world. It had reached out to me at that very moment, when everything had fallen apart around my immobile self. It had touched my brow gently, where the leaf of my headband would have been had they not taken it from me. I called it an apology, but others had called it a spiritual awakening, a natural enlightenment, or a sudden breakthrough in the material world. It had been unable to catch up to me because I had been fleeing so quickly. After I made my new connection and escaped my near certain death, I didn't really change, and not in the way you might think, anyway, and I still hated standing still and fell out of bed every night, but that was okay now, because this new presence had finally caught up to me and I didn't need to be still anymore. I called it an apology rather than an enlightenment or anything like that. That was probably the only positive change I made that day. I began to move for the right reasons. And if I had to, I could occasionally settle down. Wake up, idiot. As of right now. I opened my eyes, which seemed to be bleary, and looked down from the tree I was sitting in. I saw Sasuke giving me a cute little scowl, and then I threw my head back in a yawn that showed how aware I was. I stretched and twisted my neck left and right, and after opening my back, I finally focused all of my attention on my teammate. I could meditate when I needed to, and for once I did. The realization I had gained about the world was still there, and I could still feel it patiently hovering just out of reach, but now I had the mindset but not the strength, whereas before I had the strength but not the mindset. Yin and yang, body and soul. I had a feeling that this new life of mine would be extremely frustrating. You bastard, what do you want? Kakashi, Sensei isn't here yet, so I can sleep all night. I complained as I sank gently from the tree and crouched it in front of my teammate. She broke off, here, and threw a roll of cloth at me, which I caught and eyed with curiosity. It was slightly larger than my head and heavier than it appeared. You got a gift for me? Shocked, I asked, searching my memory for any gift from Sasuke, and finding, predictably, nothing. At the time, the closest thing to a gift Sasuke had given me was. It wasn't worth thinking about now, so I pushed that specific experience back into the dusty recesses of my mind. You said you wanted to see something from my clan's armory, said Sasuke, rolling her eyes. Oh, indeed. She described her clan's armory, which got me pretty excited. I cried, tearing into the cloth wrapping with a fervor. During one of the few lunches that I had managed to wrangle the distant Uchiha into, the topic of one-sided conversation had fallen to the Uchiha district and all the cool shit that was still hanging around there. The introductions we'd done for Team 7 yesterday had only reinforced my initial reluctance to bring up anything about the massacre, but I also knew that if Sasuke didn't accept it quickly, things would collapse as they had in the past. I want to kill someone in particular. As I unrolled the remaining fabric, my pessimistic thoughts vanished in a moment as I gazed at the armor resting on my lap. My insides roiled with memories as I turned one of the armored gauntlets over and looked blankly at the quality of the metal plates. A pair of deep blue coat gleaming in the rising sun. The Uchiha symbol emblazoned upon each one where the back of my hand would be. This second life was going to be more difficult than I anticipated if this was how every day would be. I finally decided, these aren't weapons, and I looked back up at Sasuke with what I hoped was convincing dissatisfaction. She didn't know that, not anymore, that these had actually been my main weapons against her damn sword while we were both abroad and always on the hunt. Sasuke remarked dismissively, they're the only thing I trust you not to break before the end of the day, and they're close enough. There were things missing, things that made my teeth grind and my chest burn, little expressions, shared looks, and most importantly, ease. Ease in arguing over anything and everything, no matter how delicate the subject. Ease in talking 1 minute and fighting the next. I let myself get angry and snap back at her, slipping into a routine that was both incredibly familiar and incredibly out of date. It was easy to run fingers through each other's unruly hair, to hold each other so tightly that neither could breathe, to toss the other person to the ground, and to compete in a completely different way. I snarled, all right, I'll put on the dumb gloves. Unable to look her in the eye or anywhere. Really, I yanked them on under Sasuke's smug, watchful gaze. It was clear that this would be more difficult than I had anticipated. It was all I could do to keep my composure as the world was engulfed in a sea of vivid orange. It was hard to admit, even to myself, but I had been spoiled in my previous life. I had left Konoha and had gotten used to living without distractions like duty, loyalty, and Haruno Sakura. My life had been filled with constant conflict, and it had ruined me beyond redemption. One person in particular was someone I had always looked for to satisfy my desire for a good fight, someone who never gave up on me, regardless of how notorious I became, someone I could always rely on for a fight that made my heart race, and someone I never let slip away from my advances, regardless of the circumstances at the time. Maybe, spoiled, wasn't the best word to use. Perhaps, my past life had made me addicted to Uzumaki Naruto. Would be more accurate. Every few seconds, one of my fingers would twitch, and the muscles coiled tight in my legs would spasm, pushing me forward, as I squatted in the shade of a tree, single Tomo Sharingan spinning slowly, surveying the sea of blonde shinobi smashing against Hitaki Kakashi like waves upon a cliffside. I was itching to reunite his gauntlets with my blade, a desperate, even. Observing my future rival in action seemed to be all it took to trigger my instincts. Following the rules and fighting alongside Naruto instead of against him. This was going to be more difficult than I anticipated. Sasuke. I frowned when I heard a familiar girl's voice murmuring somewhere in the branches to my right. Sakura, what do you want? I hated this girl, for heaven's sake. The elite Jonin's chakra briefly surged as he reached across the training ground to latch onto one of the clones at the back of the crowd, switching the two in an expert body replacement. Below, a small team of Naruto's clones anchored Kakashi to the ground, allowing what my Sharingan told me was the original to dash in and grab the bells at his waist. The original heaved his clone through the air at Kakashi, and the other clones present hurried to follow the projectile shinobi. The clone cried out in surprise, thrashing instinctively against the other clones holding him in place, but the original gave him no time to be confused, and Naruto grabbed the front of his clone's jacket, which was at about the same height as the bells, and spun around with a shout. The unconventional rerouting of his forces made my lips quiver. Not bad, fool. As Sakura crept through the branches until she was crouching too close to me, she whispered, well, I just thought since Kakashi Sensei only has 2 bells. Perhaps we could cooperate to get a bell? My eyes narrowed. If my memory served me well, Sakura had offered the same thing in a previous life, but I had turned it down in favor of finding a better hiding place. What about Naruto? This time, I asked, and she sneered. That idiot? He's attempting a direct battle with a Jonin. He would only hinder us, wouldn't he? If only I could show this girl the sorrow she had caused, the pain and self-doubt she had hammered into the fierce blue eyes of the only man I'd ever loved, and watch the horror dawn as she realized exactly what she had wrought, exactly what kind of enemy she had made in Maya. My fingers twitched again, but for different reasons. Sasuke? Did I say something wrong? Sakura squeaked. Your eyes. This previous body of mine was terribly low on chakra, so it would have to change soon. I blinked, suddenly aware of the frantic spinning of the Tomo in my eyes, and cut the chakra from my bloodline because I had already spent too much chakra on it and I was only surveying the fight. Even though I had always known that my time fighting overseas had benefited me much more than my years of solitary training in Konoha, I was unaware of how drastically the results had changed. I finally told Sakura, he's holding his own so far, and it was true he hadn't yet approached either of the bells, but he had made Kakashi put his disgusting orange book away so he could handle the sheer number of solid clones that were being used. Is he? However, he has yet to touch Kakashi, sensei. I yelled, then help him, and leapt from the tree, frustrated with the girl with the pink hair and unable to stop myself from fighting. The Chikuto, which I had grabbed as an afterthought while searching for the gauntlets I had given to Naruto, punched through my target's chest like rice paper, skewering him to the ground as I spun my straight sword free from its place at my hip and gained enough momentum to drive my target into the ground when I fell upon him with my blade. I blinked as the Naruto clone let out a single, wet gasp and scattered into chakra smoke. Hold on. The real Naruto swore, leapt back from Kakashi, and glared at me as I looked up. What the hell, bastard? Sincere error. Without anything to enhance it, Kakashi could counter it with whatever he happened to have in his flak jacket today, and I would have to close that specific skill gap as soon as I regained a firm grasp on my elemental manipulation. I hurried forward, sword held loosely in my right hand, weaving through clones towards the Jonin with the bells. The weapon felt wrong in my grip without any lightning to pierce with or divine black fire to scour with. Resolved, I swung, and its sharp edge cut true as I lunged forward, polished steel flashing in the midday Suna, a subpar weapon for a subpar me, but for the moment, it would do. Crimson blood sprayed through the spaces in its fingers as another of Naruto's clones gripped its slit throat, scattering it before it hit the ground. Sasuke. Oh no, yes, we did pass, Naruto cried, throwing his arms up in jubilation as he danced about the bridge connecting Training Ground 7 to the rest of the district. And we totally kicked ass, too. Despite her proud smile, Sakura shook her head at his antics, and Kakashi chuckled lightly as he reached out to tangle his student's wild blonde hair. The elite Genin said, "Don't get too excited, now," avoiding Naruto's attempt to swat his hand away with a smooth pat on the shoulder instead. "We wouldn't want you to burn yourself out before the celebration, Naturally, when Kakashi mentioned the lunch he had promised them for doing so well on the test, Naruto lit up. "Alright, food. Alright, what ought we to purchase? Ramen, barbecue, and ramen with barbecue are all available." Sakura interrupted, "I don't like ramen," and Naruto staggered to a stop, sweating profusely. "I prefer sushi." He gave her a shaky smile and shuddered, saying, "Well, nobody's perfect, right?" When Naruto's eyes fell on me like a drowning man on a raft, I snorted out of my spot in the back of the group, where I had been secretly enjoying the glow of his excitement, and my heart began to beat a little faster. "Sasuke, what are your thoughts?" he asked frantically, and I feigned to consider it for a second. "Sushi's fine." Even though I wasn't a huge sushi fan, I couldn't help but admire his horrified expression. Kakashi nodded in agreement and grinned at Naruto's increasing hysteria. "Sushi it is." The streets were crowded with both civilians and shinobi, and I let myself get nostalgic as I took in the swinging paper lanterns strung up between buildings in preparation for one of the spring festivals. It had been a long time since I had seen Konoha in such good spirits, so we left the training ground district and headed into the afternoon markets, taking turns scouting stalls and making sure Naruto didn't run off to drown himself in cheap ramen. Even though I hated it sometimes, this village had once been my home, and it was part of the majority of my best memories. If I could correct my mistakes from the past, the rest would be the same. I pushed my way through groups and couples of all kinds, keeping my teammates in sight in case either of them did something foolish, and I watched with uncovered disdain as civilian after shinobi and civilian after civilian bumped into Naruto and then retreated, their faces alarmed, uneasy, and terrified. Kakashi led us through the crowds, his bobbing gray hair a beacon among the waves of common colors. They were all trash. What did he see in them? What drove him to fight so hard to keep them safe? Why did he stay? Why did he pick them over me? I apologize. Apologies. I apologize. Oh, be careful with those. I'm sorry, grandmother. As I stewed in my outrage, Naruto chanted, happily grinning and apologizing to everyone who had given him a strange look. When we reached Sushi Delight, a surprisingly upscale sushi restaurant, Kakashi hurried us past the solemn-faced doorman, who bowed deeply as we went by, and Kakashi bowed his head in return. Kakashi stated, "We'll be taking a booth today," and the attendant gave a solemn nod. Naturally, Hitaki-san. I'm assuming you'll be taking seats? With a laugh, Kakashi gestured to an open table close to the bar and said, "You know me too well, Okura-san." I looked at Naruto, who was eyeing the menus on the table with an anxiousness I hadn't seen in him since that one time on top of the Hokage's desk, and he hung back to joke around as we made our way to the booth. Sakura slid into the left booth, smiling tentatively and patting the spot next to her. Before he could react, I rolled my eyes and pushed him into the right booth, slipping in behind him. "It's just fish," I told him, looking into his deceived eyes. Sakura added, trying to hide the slight pain my rejection had caused, "Eating something nutritious once in a while wouldn't kill you. You might even grow an inch." "You're so mean, Sakura, I'm merely saying." "All right, then." As he appeared sitting next to Sakura in a body flicker, Kakashi said brightly, "I made sure to order a full platter since Naruto said he was so hungry." Behind my bridged fingers, I smiled as Naruto let out a groan of pain. A few minutes later, drinks arrived, and as the rest of the team talked about the missions we would be going on, the training Kakashi would be giving us, and so on, my thoughts started to wander. Kakashi was as silent about the entire situation as I remembered him being the last time I asked, so our better test results had not altered his plan to put us in D ranks. I was staring down at my menu with hooded eyes, chin propped up by my linked fingers, dark, ugly emotion writhing inside my chest, clawing and twisting my chakra into something obscene, my teeth clenching of their own volition, and my focus wandered, and as had all too frequently happened since returning to this time frame, it drifted towards a very specific person. Since my transmigration, this feeling had been bothering me. It would dig into me whenever I wasn't focused on the timeline, Naruto, or something appropriately urgent. It would taunt me, whisper to me, and test me. When asked about my dreams during our introductions, it had suddenly struck me. Even in my own private thoughts, I hadn't said that I wanted to correct my mistakes, develop into a strong kunoichi, or even, to my hidden shame, defend the person I loved. To kill a specific person had been the same as the previous time. Madara Uchiha. Sasuke? Sakura inquired, and I twitched, sensing that everyone was suddenly worried about me. What? She said, we asked if you'd like to start doing missions tomorrow, and I nodded once while closing my eyes and taking a moment to control my emotions. Fine. What are you up to? Naruto nudged me and said, you suddenly became sulky. I smirked as I turned back to my table and saw Kakashi raising an eyebrow at me. I was unwilling to look at him while the memories evoked by that feeling were still so fresh, so I landed upon a passing waitress, reached out, and took the slimiest piece of sushi from the platter. She walked right by, unconcerned. I thrust 3 fingers into Naruto's stomach without looking, and when he gasped, I thrust what I thought was a piece of salmon wrapped in seaweed into his mouth. Sakura giggled, and Kakashi laughed amusedly as he clawed at the roll of napkins wrapped around his chopsticks, searching for something to spit the expensive fish into, but it was too late. The blonde shinobi slammed his head back against the wall in his haste to pull away, but it was too late. I heard a strangled noise of pain, and this time I looked at him, just to see how his face twisted in disgust at the texture. So slimy. I tucked my chin back onto my bridged fingers and thanked him in silence for lifting my spirits, at least for the moment. I knew that once we were apart, the feeling would come back with all its intensity, and I would spend the rest of the day reflecting on what had happened before my transmigration. Madara would be at the start and finish of it all, everything she had done to Naruto and to me, the joy she had destroyed, the suffering she had brought about. And the one I had lost to her. When our own waitress brought a huge platter of raw fish, I directed myself to eat, listen, and most importantly, not think, concentrating on the boy who was still alive and breathing next to me for this one meal rather than the exhausted, quiet, dead. After shoving another piece of sushi into Naruto's mouth, I desperately tried to focus on the ensuing hysterics. This was going to be far more difficult than I had anticipated. My voice was husky with pain and unwavering resolve as I yelled, "Come on, into the starlight. Show me what you're made of, prove that you have what it takes to be Uzumaki Naruto, Toad Sage of Konoha, 9th wonder of the world." All too glad to comply, my clone bounded out of the trees and the two of us engaged in intense close combat. With our gauntlet-clad fists hovering protectively in front of our faces, we blurred in and out of ducks and jukes as we pushed our untrained bodies to the limit, turning the forest around us into a blur of midnight colors. The clone swayed with the beat of our conversation as it repeatedly jabbed at my face and stomach. His criminally attractive face was set in a rictus of determination as he pushed me back. He hit me with the speed and intensity of a chakra construct that didn't have to be concerned about going too far and getting killed. My clone knew that even if he lost, someone else would take his place, so he was free to lash out at me with all the Uzumaki Naruto I had managed to fit into his still, stocky body. Nevertheless, he was insufficient to defeat me. I muttered, "You are not Uzumaki Naruto," as I ducked under his guard and dodged his cross. I clenched my fists in front of my face, then threw the right one out to my side and dug the left one into his exposed gut. When I spread my fingers wide, a vivid blue chakra blossomed in my gauntlet's palm. Rasengan. My father's pride and joy replaced my left hand in the clone's stomach, and when the first blow of the jutsu struck him, he gasped in a mixture of shock and agony. I clenched my jaw and concentrated all of my energy on holding the tiny Bijudama tightly in my hands. When the Rasengan reached the end of its first grinding phase and started the transition into its drilling phase, the late night sounds of Konoha's training ground forests were broken by the sharp whine of chakra whirling against chakra. I gave myself a moment of victory when my clone finally dispersed, a ruptured stomach going far beyond its threshold for damage. Then the Rasengan blew up in my face after faltering. A few hours later, with a spring in my step and a bunch of repulsively sweaty clothes stuck to my skin, I ran among the trees as the sun started to rise and shinobi started to stream into the training grounds district for morning practice and team meetings. It had been a good training session. I rushed to make amends when I reached my destination, the small river that ran through my own training grounds as well as several of the Genin training grounds. In the hollow of a tree I had set aside as my laundry basket away from home, I stripped off jacket, shirt, pants, and boxers one by one, creating a nasty pile. After soaking up the early morning breeze for a short while, I dove headfirst into the river. The aches and pains I had suffered from my clones and failed attempts at the Rasengan were banished by the cold water, which slapped my slight fatigue silly. I shook my head under the water, scratching my scalp frantically, and smiled with delight as the cold sank into my hair's roots. A minute or two later, after washing myself as thoroughly as possible, I started down the river. Only my own brushstrokes broke the dancing fledgling sunlight across the water's surface. Since my transmigration, I've made it a habit to spend my nights literally pounding myself into the ground in an attempt to regain my lost abilities. And since my apartment was much more isolated than I remembered, I've made it a habit to take the river to team training rather than taking a shower there. In any case, it's simpler this way. I swam through training grounds 12, 11, 10, 9, and 8, keeping track as I went. I waved when I saw a girl in a bulky beige coat rushing through a pair of kata. I called, "Morning, Hinata." Hinata trained a lot, but I had never noticed my first time around as a Genin. Hinata was always there when I passed by, but I would have long since left by the time most Genin teams got together in the morning. Since she was always wearing her Byakugan and appeared to be practicing some Hyuga technique, I could tell that she spent nearly as much time training as I did prior to team meetings. By the time I passed her, why else would she be flushed and stumbling in and out of her kata? Long before I arrived, she was obviously out there giving it her all. That kind of work ethic is definitely something I could respect. She called back, "Gee. Good morning, Naruto," in a strained voice that was probably caused by all the work she did. A few minutes later, I arrived at my destination, a tree in training ground 7 that I had named my dresser away from home and filled with extra clothing and a towel. After dragging myself out of the river and drying off, I put on my mesh shirt, jumper, and orange pants. After that, I had nothing to do until the other members of my team showed up, so I climbed up my dresser tree and spread out on the branch I had named my bed away from home. To the untrained eye, I closed my eyes, threw an arm over my face, and fell asleep. In actuality, I shifted my attention from the outside world and plunged headfirst into my chakra system, a brilliant sea of warmth and light. I paradoxically drew myself closer to the infinitely more brilliant chakra system of the world around me as I sank deeper and deeper within myself over time. Purposefully connecting with nature without truly using its energies was something I had never done before my transmigration. There had been no need for it. My body, my yang, had already adjusted to the rhythm of the world's chakras when the time had come for me to activate what the toads used to call sage mode. Mostly by accident, but whatever. But now I had the yin, the mindset, but I no longer had the shinobi experiences that had conditioned my yang. The Rikudo Sennin erased it. I therefore made myself remain motionless whenever I could and tried my best to persuade my inexperienced body to comprehend. I didn't feel like I was making progress or that what I was doing was right or wrong. Once everything was considered, Uzumaki Naruto was not a very smart man. I could be quick and nimble, but I wouldn't even try to understand the complexities of the chakra system that ran through the entire universe because it was theoretical bullshit. Rather, I tried to make the yang I had now feel the same by prodding it with memories of my former self and the feel of the yang I had lost. To put it another way, I was trying to fool my body and consequently, nature into believing that I was already wise. No, I also didn't understand it. In any case, it helped me stay focused and was somewhat soothing. Both were positive things, especially in light of today's events. Naturally, today marks the beginning of one of a few occasions that have been etched so vividly in my mind that, even years later, I can still recall every detail of what was about to happen, including the way the bile would taste in my throat as I threw my teammates over my shoulders and ran away from the battle that would ultimately result in Hitaki Kakashi's death. Team 7 embarked on our first C-rank mission today. My relationship with Sasuke had been established at the start of the journey. My first and second introductions to my fellow Jinchuriki were just getting started. For the sensei I never had the opportunity to get to know well, it was the start of the end. At any rate, it had been. Team 7 was going to return to Konoha as a whole this time. I decided it was going to be a little different this time. And I meant fully by slightly. I had already twisted my chakra coils into a state of being that was entirely different from what they had been earlier that morning by the time Sasuke finally made the decision to appear. I didn't have to be a sage to sense the expectant gaze she directed at me as she leaned against my dresser tree. I started to navigate through the grasping roots of Tenketsu and the star. Like clusters of chakra surrounding my internal organs as I started the disorienting process of releasing myself from the innermost workings of my chakra. With a sharp gasp of cool air and the taste of sap in my mouth, I returned to the outside world. My eyes flickered open, and I gradually adapted to the mixture of greens and browns that was so different from the dazzling spectrum of light that was pulsing inside of me. I twisted left and right, getting a few satisfying pops in my back for the effort, and sat up after shaking myself out of my daze. I then reached down and encircled the branch below with my fingers. For the benefit of my teammate who was watching, I arched my back and let out a loud yawn. I also encouraged my chakra to flow through the hand that held the branch. Similar to the sensation you get in your stomach during an unexpected free fall, a humorous little fluttering sensation went down my arm. I squinted, modifying my chakra's flow to fit my coil's new configuration, until a few seconds later I achieved the intended outcome and my hand adhered to the branch. I swung down to Sasuke, satisfied. Shinobi didn't usually go around rearranging the chakra coils that the Rikudo Sennin had so kindly given them for a reason. In this context, generally, means, never. Without a grasp of chakra at the level of a sensor, or, say, an Uzumaki, it was kind of impossible. The majority of the time, it didn't offer any discernible advantages. I was only doing it because I knew that if I could make my chakra flow in a particular direction, positive things would happen. And lastly, it was risky. To the untrained eye, something that might appear to be the smallest adjustment could mean losing years and years of hard-won chakra control that would never be recovered. It was fortunate for me that my naive 13-year-old self had no chakra control to lose, and it was even more fortunate that my keen chakra awareness had not been lost during the transmigration. Sasuke asked, "What are you thinking about?" And I blinked. After receiving a couple of cheek slaps, I was back in the real world. While meditation itself wasn't too bad, removing myself from my wise thoughts afterward was a real pain in the ass. "Forgot to go home last night," I admitted, somewhat truthfully, wondering if my plants are gonna be okay. Her contempt enveloped me like a cozy hug, and I couldn't help but pause to appreciate it. "Out pranking again, hum?" she asked. Even though it made my teeth grind, it was preferable to the last emotion I had witnessed on her stunning, enraged, and incredible face. Better than the tears and the horror that had shattered my heart into so many painful fragments, every time. "Always. Not this time," I exclaimed, proudly prodding myself with my thumb. "I was working on a kick-ass new jutsu all night." She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and thoughtfulness as she asked, "Were you?" An initial glimmer of excitement, which had persisted throughout our subsequent interactions, was visible in her face. Sasuke still enjoyed a good fight. I gave her a cheeky smile when she tilted her head just enough to invite me to continue, and I nodded, "Hey, Sakura." As I turned to welcome our third teammate, Sasuke's eyes narrowed dangerously, but I didn't give it much thought. Even this far back, there had always been tension between my teammates. However, if everything went according to plan, there would be no reason for things to go terribly wrong as they did the last time. I was sure I could fix this much, at least. If it were the last goddamn thing I did, Sakura and Sasuke would become friends. Sakura reluctantly said, morning," in response to my greeting. She always seemed caught off guard around me ever since I went back to being younger. It appeared that she had no idea how to handle an Uzumaki Naruto who merely wished to be her friend. Man, but I knew absolutely nothing at the time, did I? I theatrically hissed, "Say good morning, Sasuke," and nudged the girl next to me. She turned her head away from us both with a huff that I only noticed because I was listening for it, and her expression somehow became even more poisonous at that point. She's too adorable." With little expectation of a response, I asked, "So what do you guys think today will be? Training, D ranks, and more training? Or D ranks, training, and more D ranks?" Overall, this second chance at life has been rather uninteresting thus far. I suppose it was expected. Mostly, I've been getting ready for today and trying my hardest to rekindle the connections that initially drew me back here. However, it seems to me that things will be changing soon. Sasuke abruptly said, "Tell me next time," as she gave me a sidelong glance. "When you're going to be training by yourself. I'll join you." Yes, I already knew how that would turn out. I still hadn't been giving it my all during team training, but I didn't have much power to control myself at the moment, nearly nothing in comparison to the kind of crazy shit I was used to throwing around. Primarily because I didn't believe that my still, faulty control wouldn't injure one of my teammates. I knew for a fact that Sasuke would not be pleased if I suddenly pulled out the Rasengan, even if my grasp of it was not as complete as it had been. My solo training sessions were my only chance to regain my competence. Still, I was pleased to see that she was beginning to show concern once more. It had felt that way at the time, even though the Sasuke I had known before had never truly stopped caring. And at least she was concerned, even if this new, old Sasuke was only interested in my secret kick-ass jutsu. After all, I appeared to be making some headway. There was absolutely no progress on my part. The last time I held the man I love in my arms was 2 weeks, 4 days, 5 hours, and roughly 38 minutes ago. It has been even longer since I did so without worrying about his imminent death. At this point, my sanity would undoubtedly be slipping out of my grasp if I still had any left. Unfortunately, Instead of losing any fictitious positive aspects of my psyche, I've been accumulating negative aspects even more quickly than usual. In particular, sleep has turned into a gory experience, to the extent that I've made the decision to completely avoid it. We follow Hitaki to the Hokage Tower while the source and target of my most recent night terrors whistles a jovial little tune while his fingers tangle with his unkempt blonde hair. It's still a little wet, and I can't help but wonder how long it's been since we took a bath together. Too much time. Too long. I suppress a sudden surge of desire, complaining to myself that his hands ought to be tucked into my hair the way mine should be in his. I've decided that my current plan isn't going to work after 2 weeks, 4 days, 5 hours, and roughly 39 minutes. It's all well and good to shape Naruto into the man I know him to be, but when I think about it, it was our split up as devoted shinobi and missing nin that, ironically, had united us as a couple. This time, that would not be an option. This was due to a number of equally significant factors, including my conversation with the Rikudo Sennin and my newly acquired knowledge of the Uchiha massacre. The most urgent of these was, of course, that if I continued on the same path, Naruto would not see me in that manner for a number of years. I'm not a woman with patience. I was already perilously close to my limit after 2 weeks, 4 days, 5 hours, and roughly 40.1 minutes. I was going to have to change my strategy because I was unable to win his love the way I had in the past, and opening up to him as a sparring partner and teammate was not going nearly as well as I remembered. I would have to use the conventional method to win Naruto's love. May my sinful soul be cleansed by Amaterasu. Actually, Kakashi, I was wondering if your team would be up to a C-rank mission today. At some point during my sour thoughts, I blinked and realized that we had arrived at the mission distribution center. That was a worry. After maintaining my fully developed Sharingan active at all times became an option, I never bothered to develop or even maintain situational awareness. That would need to be altered. Or I'd have to regain my vision. Whichever was first. Kakashi tapped his pornographic book to his chin and wondered, a C rank, For the briefest of moments, an unreadable brown eye fixed itself on me, and I raised an eyebrow. Is it really necessary to ask? Under his mask, he flashed a small smile, shifting his focus from Sakura to me. The expression of the other Kunoichi, which was half anxiety and half joy, was fixed on the Hokage. In my objective view, it made her appear constipated. When it became apparent that she was still unsure of her position, Kakashi looked away and met Naruto's gaze. Naruto was grinning. Not dancing, not yelling at the top of his lungs, not smiling, not any other grating substitute. He simply stood there with his arms relaxed at his sides, grinning up at Kakashi with a grin that made my heart skip a beat. I've seen this smile before. I have witnessed a smile that brings both women and enemy shinobi to their knees, with little distinction between the two. A tiny parting of the lips and a flash of overly sharp canines were all that was involved. More deadly than any Raiden jutsu I was aware of, it caused his eyes to dance like lightning. That smile pleased me. I really enjoyed it. Let's do it. HNNNN. Kakashi exclaimed joyfully, well, if you're sure, as though Naruto's viewpoint were the sole consideration in his choice. I could have been wrong. I never did learn how much of his easygoing demeanor was a FA section aide prior to his brutal demise. How may we serve, Hokage? Sama. The secretary standing obediently by the mission desk hurried out of the room, and a few minutes after the Hokage finished the pre-mission pleasantries, she returned with a portly old man in tow. Your client is a merchant from Yu no Kuni. He's finished his business with Konoha for the year and would like you to escort him back home, in case he runs into any unsavory characters during the trip. Ryoko, if you could fetch Kahaya-san. Kahaya-san declared, good morning, Hokage. Sama. A pleasure, as always, and bowed as deeply as his stomach would permit. The hot water merchant wore well-worn travel attire that complemented his thinning gray hair. He carried himself with the composure of a civilian who had long since given up caring and knew they were at the mercy of every shinobi in the room. Like his mission, he was completely forgettable. This was a pointless portion of our journey. The true test would be later. I went back to what was important while Kakashi introduced us to the client and vice versa. Specifically, winning back Naruto's affection. To be honest, I wasn't having as much trouble as I liked to portray my attempt to make my beloved fool better in his younger, infinitely more annoying form. He hadn't done anything really wrong yet. In fact, he hadn't done anything annoying, aside from the general Narutoisms that would always be a part of him. The fact that I only had to treat him vaguely like an equal to drastically alter his behavior was a little annoying. I wished I had done it sooner the first time. Regretfully, our romantic relationship was not progressing, which implied that we weren't physically moving forward either. I have not caused him to bleed in such a long time. How recently have I pushed my icy steel through him? When was the last time he struck me with his wood? On both counts, it was too long. Too long. Answers. Answers. So far, traditional team interactions have improved our relationships with each other. Maybe a conventional romance will function similarly. According to what little I remember of it before we destroyed it with our own crazy relationship, his attraction to Sakura certainly seemed conventional enough. Naruto, who was 12 years old, liked girls with attractive appearances, perfume, and endearing dispositions. He would eventually wake up and prefer women who were like me. I could comply until then. Alright, team, we'll meet at the northern gate in 1 hour. Pack carefully, and don't forget your rations. Rations, perhaps? I knew exactly where to begin. With frightened eyes, Naruto asked, "You made me a bento?" As though the food box I was holding was an explosive tag attached to his youngest Uzumaki, and I was just a hand seal away from detonating it. It had been a pleasant evening, I said calmly, yes, unsure of what to do now that I had made the meal and served it to him. I must admit that I knew very little about traditional courtship. Maybe I wasn't being explicit enough. I thought you might like something more appetizing than field rations while we're away from Konoha. Naruto retreated half a step, and I caught a glimpse of Sakura observing us in utter confusion. Although his book covered his face, I could tell that Kakashi was laughing more than usual. Was there anything else I was missing? When that Hyuga bitch wanted to give him something, what did she always do? I muttered, "Please accept it," and turned my head modestly away from him. Silence fell for a beat. The Chunin who were watching the gates even leaned forward in their booth to take in the scene. Naruto inhaled deeply. Kai. I took great care not to stab him. Then he accepted the bento with a sheepish smile. I guess I shouldn't have expected any different, but he still appeared somewhat shaken up. I had witnessed firsthand how unfriendly the rest of the village was to him. It's possible that this modest gift was the first genuine one he had ever received. And wasn't that a gloomy idea? He said, "Thanks, Sasuke," while holding the box a foot or so from him. Now, how would the Hyuga respond? I looked away again and tapped my fingers together. I already detested this. Please save me, Amaterasu. Given that she never gave Naruto a glance, how could that girl possibly claim to be attracted to him? I did say, "I hope you like it, though." Sakura squeaked, "Sasuke? Are you okay?" A moment too late, I realized that the Hyuga never spoke so icily. "Yes," I said. Oh, well. In reality, I had no desire to be Hyuga Hinata. I felt soiled just thinking about it, and feeble, and pitiful. So, did you get Sakura one, or did you want us to share? No, I yelled. That was almost the last thing I wanted, second only to not killing Uchiha Madara. Following a pause, I added, "It's for you. For the lunch you bought me, before." Our team and the Chunin who had nothing better to do fell into an uncomfortable silence. Since our client had not yet arrived, Naruto had the ideal opportunity to sample the bento and discover my culinary prowess. I had never really prepared meals for him before, and I had no intention of doing so frequently in the future, in any case. He finally got the hint. Oh, right. He exclaimed as he opened the bento, his mouth gaping slightly at what was inside. I had thought about forming the rice balls into his face or hearts, but I had thrown the latter idea aside as being a bit depressing and the former as being too obvious. Rather, I had created one in the shape of an Uchiwa and another in the shape of the Uzumaki spiral crest. Easy and efficient. His words, "It looks great," I gave him a raised eyebrow. Well, bottoms up. Kahaya yelled, "Kakashi-san." Naruto sighed in relief and slammed the bento closed. As the old man huffed and puffed up to us, I crossed my arms over my chest, barely controlling the urge to put my chikuto between his eyes. I'm terribly sorry for the delay. I got caught up in some last-minute goodbyes, and you know how those are. Kakashi gave me a very amused look and said, "Not a problem, Kahaya-san," while putting his book in his pocket. Then I frowned, "Shall we?" Next time. After a while, when the sun had long since sunk into its descent and past its apex, Sakura said, "Kakashi. Sensei, where exactly are we going in Yu no Kuni?" "A little resort village called Haru just off of Yugakure," Kakashi responded, looking up at the sky while covering his eye with his book. "It'll take us a few days to get there at this pace, so we'll turn in for the night once we reach the next town." Kahaya wheezed, leaning heavily on his walking stick and trying not to have a heart attack. Fantastic idea," he said. I supported 100%. Sakura wiped the perspiration from her enormous brow and asked hopefully, "Is the town close?" It turned out to be an extremely hot day. Even the approaching evening didn't help the notoriously humid Hai no Kuni. Kakashi gave nod. He hummed thoughtfully as he tilted his head and said, "Very close. Only 3 or 4 more hours if I remember correctly." Sakura moaned pitifully, and Naruto made a low, pitched sound of disgust before swinging his backpack around and searching through it. But that was at a Jonin's pace, come to think of it. After realizing what he was after a few seconds, I casually reached into my own pack, took out my canteen, and took a slow, opulent pull. I gently touched its lip with my tongue, took a deep sip, and then gently removed it from my lips with a pop. Naruto threw his pack back over his shoulder and cursed a few moments later. "Thirsty?" Naruto swallowed after turning to face me, and then my canteen. "Little bit." "Take the rest." I offered him the bottle with generosity. I sensed that Kakashi was watching me, but I ignored it. He wouldn't meddle, and I would terminate him if he did. Naruto's gaze brightened. "You sure?" he inquired, almost trembling with the urge to grab the water out of my grasp. He quickly gulped it down after I hummed my agreement and tossed it to him. I waited for him to finish. With a satisfied sigh, he returned the canteen to me after wiping away some of the moisture that had dribbled enticingly down his throat and chin. To his perplexity, I turned my back on him and buried my face in my hands while doing my best to channel Hyuga Hinata. I muttered, an indirect kiss, wishing I could make myself blush at will. Sakura gaped, Naruto tried his best to choke on air, and Kakashi expertly transformed a snort into a courteous cough. "What the fuck, Sasuke? HN. Next time." Both the town where we spent the night and the hotel Kakashi chose were just as I had remembered them to be. Charming, roomy, and with an excessive number of lodging options. Since he was the one making the payment, Kahaya was given a room of his own. Kakashi and Naruto took another, leaving Sakura and me. Not large enough to separate me from Sakura, but not enough to cram us all into one room. Unfortunately. Despite my S-class knowledge, this younger body of mine remained a genin's frame, and Kakashi was an experienced jonin, so I would have very little time to complete the next step of my plan. I didn't think I could sneak into his room and take Naruto because I didn't trust my infiltration abilities enough. I would have to make the most of my time. I ended up taking a bath in the men's hot springs after using a few well-chosen words and even more carefully chosen kunai to purge it of all occupants. Along with several other toiletries, the hotel staff had left a sponge in my room. I squeezed it and ran it between my thighs. It ghosted back up my pale white skin on its way to my neck after sliding down to the tips of my toes, leaving suds in its wake. One stroke at a time, I scrubbed the perspiration and grime from my body with the elegance of a noblewoman, all the while humming a song that one of my aunts used to sing to me before Itachi killed her. I used a few buckets of water to rinse everything off after I was completely clean and covered in soap and shampoo. After listening carefully, I picked up the sponge and resumed washing when I heard nothing. I was in the middle of my third scrubbing cycle when I heard the sharp rap of the changing room door opening. I got off my stool, stretched languidly, and grinned slowly and naked as the day I was born. A sharp intake of breath came from a familiar set of lungs as the door to the hot springs slid open. Grinning even more, I leaned over to pick up my latest pail of water. HNNGH. Naruto, I said, trying to make the name sound as shocking and outraged as possible. It was challenging, but I was somewhat assisted by the fact that he was unable to see my cunning smile. "This is the women's bath, you know." I drained the bucket over my head, possibly wriggling my hips a little as I shook the moisture from my hair. Naruto bit out, "The hell it is," with far more indignation than I could muster. "It's okay. In any case, I prefer an irate Naruto to a flustered one. Enough to measure, but not much." I glanced at him, wide-eyed, just enough. Unamused, Naruto crossed his arms over his bare chest and said, "I picked the wrong one." "I see," I muttered. For this one, I had thought about using the Hyuga once more, but I had brushed it off as being too dramatic for such a character. It wouldn't help me if I fainted or stammered like one of Orochimaru's servants. I had thought of channeling Sakura as well. Don't ask me why. I ultimately chose to take a moderate stance. Reaching down again, I picked up the sponge and pointed to my stool. "Would you like me to wash your back?" Without saying another word, Naruto returned to the changing room. "Oh no, next time. Uzumaki Naruto is my name. I was and still am a Konoha shinobi. Uchiha Madara killed me when I was 18. I passed away as the Gama Sennin, the most devoted Konoha shinobi of my generation, and, if the persistent rumors were accurate, Tsunade's heir apparent. I lost my life protecting the village that had grown to love me. Without a doubt, I would do it again. Thus, I passed away. Then, without puberty, I woke up. Figure it out. Since then, I've been constantly moving. Getting a handle on my chakra system, relearning this stocky little frame of mine, and using shadow clones to beat myself to death. I have been occupied. Before and after my death, I discovered a few things, but I still don't know a lot. I have a long way to go. The world needs to be saved, and I'm Uzumaki Naruto. It's a big popsicle for just one person. Is all I'm saying. Don't get the wrong idea. I am Uzumaki Naruto, and I am clueless about what is happening. I beseeched Kakashi, but he was obligingly preoccupied with receiving our client's gratitude for a job well done. Sakura gave me a curious shrug of her shoulders when I turned to face her. I finally decided on Sasuke and the popsicle she was shyly offering me because I had nowhere else to go. She was determined to share it after purchasing it from a local Haru vendor to combat the heat, alongside me. I shuddered. This timeline was flawed in some way. There was something wrong, but I had no idea what it was or whether I was to blame or the Rikudo Sennin. One of the two Uchiha Sasuke I knew was a girl who was only interested in killing her murderous older brother, and the other was a woman who was only interested in making me crazy. In a sexual sense. This imposter, this new Sasuke, was unlike anything I had ever seen. She was adorable. She was cute not only in appearance, she had always been pretty, but also in behavior. She was modest. My head was easier to twist into knots with genjutsu when the Sasuke I knew made eye contact whenever she could. I tried to look her in the eye, but this new Sasuke turned away. To get my attention, she snuck into the wrong bath, made bento, and planned indirect kisses. And how did she react the following day when I finally brought it up to her? I don't like you or anything, idiot. Even before I realized what was happening, she began to stutter and act as though she had no interest in me. I was the object of her crush. I was the object of a perfectly normal crush on Uchiha Sasuke, who felt ashamed of it. She had never even attempted to stab me. There was a problem. Since we left the village gates, the only way to get a familiar response from Sasuke has been to mention my pink-haired teammate. You know, Sakura looks like she could use a popsicle, I said. Furthermore, Sakura appeared to be quite frazzled due to the heat. Before settling into a pout, full, pink lips twisted into the shortest of snarls. But I did see it. I witnessed it, she said, don't make me say it, more as a demand than a plea. I didn't move to grab the fruity treat even though she wiggled it enticingly. I had no faith in that popsicle. Maybe I jumped a few inches off the ground in response to Sasuke's irate stomp of a sandaled foot, perhaps. I want to share it with you. The statement, okay, we'll share it, was excessive. I've defeated entire armies and battled Biju head, but Sasuke's agitation was simply too much. I quickly offered the popsicle back after snatching it from her hand and removing the top half in a single bite. You took too long, she said accusingly, displaying the sticky orange juice from the popsicle with the fingers of her now empty hand. Clean them off. I asked, kicking myself as soon as I said it, with what? What else? Once more, her lips quirked into a cunning grin, which was quickly followed by an embarrassed grimace. But I still saw it. Sasuke, you can't fool me. I've got you, Ayama. She mumbled, use your mouth, okay, it's time for a strategic withdrawal. You think, Naruto? Wah. I blinked, regaining consciousness just in time to crash into my sensei's back, face first. I bounced right off of him because I was the smallest shinobi, at least physically. I twisted in midair, swung up onto a nearby tree branch, and frantically scanned the area for any danger. Isn't it not happening yet? Surely it can't be? However, we have simply halted. I looked away from Kakashi's piercing eyes and coughed. What was that? I asked if you wanted to take a quick detour. There's a monument close by that I thought you might like to see. Oh. In my hurry to fix my error, I exclaimed, yeah, definitely, a little louder than I meant to. It's unbelievable that I nearly missed this. What if they had ruined everything by changing their minds while I was lost in my thoughts? I summoned a pair of cage bunshin to slap me across the face, one after the other, while the rest of my team looked on in confusion. The Naruto clone on the left, get your head in the game, yelled. I gave a nod. Yes. And watch your 8 o'clock, the Naruto clone on the right suggested. From her spot at my 8 o'clock, Sasuke arched an eyebrow. I gave a firmer nod this time. Right, I replied. They were dispelled in a single cloud of chakra smoke when I slammed their heads together after grabbing them both by their wild blonde hair. So, what about that monument, sensei? With practiced ease, Kakashi ignored my hysterics and said, if we stick to the treetops, it's a bit less than an hour off the beaten path. Follow me, You three, and try to keep up. He then takes off, guiding us out of Konoha with the same abruptness as before. Sasuke was stepping to keep up with me as we raced through the trees, and her bottomless midnight eyes were looking at me with a muted sense of concern. You okay? I shook my head and chuckled. I hadn't even realized that I was making mistakes myself, all this agony over my grand scheme and Sasuke's odd behavior. It was. I have a terrible habit. It meant many things to be a sage, especially my kind of sage. It indicated that you understood nature in a particular way, a connection, for example that provided you with a special viewpoint on everything, actually. The best example that came to mind was looking out through Hyuga's eyes after being blind for a lifetime. It wasn't an easy transition from ordinary to extraordinary perception to become a sage. It was a completely different experience. I had 7 senses, if the average shinobi had all 5 plus an additional 6th sense for chakra, and the average civilian had 5. I could experience 1,000 different types of life in ways that still baffle me today, and I could be in 1,000 different places at once. If I wasn't paying attention and no one was around to keep me in check, I could lose myself in the simple flow of nature for minutes, hours, and hours. To be honest, it was really annoying. And eventually, as I found myself immersed in the whims of nature more and more, that lack of focus began to affect my daily existence. I've never been the most focused person in the world, but occasionally my lack of focus is absurd. Such as at this moment. Fuck, I replied, sure. Sasuke hummed in a hazy agreement. I guess I'm a little bored with how the mission's been going so far, you know. But yeah, I'm fine, thanks. Good, she said absently before gasping as if she suddenly realized. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't worried about you or anything. I yelled, stop that, and, perhaps using a bit more force than was necessary in my outrage, I pushed off the next branch in my path, snapping it cleanly off the tree to which it was attached. With a cute frown on her face, Sasuke resumed her pace with me after deftly altering her flight through the air to land on a different branch. Stop what? Idiot, that thing you're doing with your personality, cut it out. What's wrong with my personality? It's all wrong, I said, pointing a finger accusingly at her. You were acting cutesy yesterday, and today you're all flustered. Like you're some girl fresh out of the academy. Sasuke appeared uncertain for the smallest of moments. Aren't I? I snapped my teeth together after opening my mouth to yell at her. Hold on. Was she not? I understood that this was the main reason I was uncomfortable with the circumstance. I have had specific expectations for my team, and Sasuke in particular, up until this point. Some expectations include, for example, that they will act as they are goddamn supposed to at this particular moment. This abrupt change in how the young and old interact, the way the love of my life was treating me, was really upsetting. Sasuke was technically a pretty young woman who had just graduated from the academy, but the problem was that she hadn't behaved that way the first time. She had been cold, aloof, and self-controlled all the time. She was pushed toward anger rather than shame the few times she was forced to step outside of her comfort zone. What caused the abrupt change, then? As of yet, I hadn't really changed anything. Would it have only taken a little more kindness to win Sasuke over the first time? No, that was not acceptable to me. In the academy, Sasuke had plenty of boys and girls lusting after her. I was by no means the first. Which had 2 possible meanings. Sasuke had a crush on me and was shy about it, or maybe the Rikudo Sennin had messed up and I got lost during my transmigration, creating this strange alternate reality. Or I tensed up. Or, I whispered, turning to face Sasuke, did you? Did I what? She asked, tilting her head away from the path ahead and looking directly into my eyes. Her expression was still a little huffy, but not in the ostentatious manner she had been expressing her feelings for the past 2 days. I've always thought her eyes were more striking without the Sharingan, as her dark eyes probed me for my secrets. Would she have you? I lost you to myself after losing him to that woman first. I will not permit it. I will never permit it. Suddenly unable to look at her for another second, I shivered and jerked away from her, onto another branch. I shook my head and angrily pushed the errant memory away. Never mind, I said. Couldn't stay. Don't linger. Nay, Sakura, spare me some water? Why didn't you buy some while we were dropping the client off? I forgot, I exclaimed, forcing a smile and racing forward to overtake my teammate with the pink hair. Have mercy on me, just this once. During the remainder of our spontaneous detour, I didn't turn to face Sasuke. I was aware that doing so would mean my demise, in one way or another. When the Valley of the End was intact and not entirely destroyed, it was quite impressive. Sakura exhaled, wow, and the amazement in her voice made me smile. We emerged at the base of the waterfall, gazing up at the two enormous statues that had given the artificial valley its name, thanks to Kakashi's Detour. Both legendary shinobi were illuminated in all their dazzling glory because there were still a few hours of unadulterated sunlight before dusk. I held up a hand against the light, looking up at Senju and Uchiha while feeling a strange mix of emotions. For the benefit of my teammates, I said, "Who are they, sensei?" These two I knew very, very well. Kakashi said, "The founders of Konoha," halting just long enough for Sakura to let out a startled gasp. "I know them," she exclaimed, pointing from one statue to another with excitement in her green eyes. With a worried sidelong glance, she interrupted herself right away, saying, "That's the Shodai Hokage, Senju Hashirama, and that's the first matriarch of the Uchiha clan." I finally let myself turn to face my other teammate. "Uchiha Madara," Sasuke concluded in a flat, unintelligible voice. Kakashi congratulated them both, saying, "Very good," brushing off the unexpected tension as though it had never happened. Perhaps, to him, it hadn't. Now, does anyone know their story? And more specifically, why those statues are here on the edge of High no Kuni and not closer to Konoha? Indeed, I did. Nope. Sasuke gave a shrug. Sakura said, "Sorry, sensei," and wow, she sounded genuinely sorry. "Great!" Kakashi exclaimed, clapping his hands together before vanishing in a leafy haze. Sakura objected and squinted up into the sunlight as I crossed my arms. He'd be right, if I recall correctly. Shortly after I landed on Kakashi, Sasuke whispered, "There," gesturing down at us with an inviting wave to the armored right shoulder of the Shodai. Sakura squeaked, "He wants us to go up there." Yes, exactly. We had to navigate our way up the various pieces of armor and weapons protruding from the Shodai's statue because we were unfamiliar with tree walking. I don't recall enjoying it all that much, and it had taken a long time. "No, not twice. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu," Sakura exclaimed. "Wah, Naruto, what are you doing?" as one of my clones gathered her in his arms in a bridal fashion and fled for the statue of the Shodai. I yelled, "Hold on tight, Sakura," as my other clone managed to get Sasuke into a suitable grip. As my clone jumped up onto the statue and began climbing it vertically, she screamed something incomprehensible in response, and tried not to break him on the way up. Now that I think about it, I could have probably spent a minute or two teaching her how to perform the tree walking exercise. Even now, her chakra control was almost flawless. Oh, well. Just before Sasuke landed on my back and wrapped her attractive legs 13 years old tightly around my waist, I was reminded of my other clone's quick demise by a pained grunt and a flood of memories. With her arms draped loosely over my shoulders, she rested her chin in the hollow of my neck and let out a sigh of satisfaction. I jerked. She whispered in my ear, "You can carry me yourself if you want to. HNNGH. Alright, act as such." When I hit the statue while running, Sasuke tightened her grip on me and molded her body to fit my body as I turned vertical. As her chest pressed against my back, I made a low, strangled noise in my throat, but I tried my best to ignore it and move up the Shodai's strangely patterned armor. Sasuke's breath was hot against my skin as she spoke softly into my ear once more. "When did you learn this, dead last?" I hummed as I searched for a plausible response. I'm not sure what to say. "I forget, actually." "Perfect. Idiot," she said with a hint of fondness. I jumped from the Shodai's blade pommel to his bulky sleeve and gave her a wry smile. I discovered Kakashi waiting for us with a curious aura about him when we eventually arrived at the shoulder. Sakura was standing slightly to the side, her arms folded, listening with barely controlled laughter behind her scowl as my clone apologized profusely. I walked over and gave him a headshake while rolling my eyes. Pop. I stopped and shifted from foot to foot for a moment, saying, "That's enough of that." When I still felt heavier than I should have at this age, I looked over my shoulder. "You can get down now, you know." Sasuke thought about that in silence. It's not like I want to stay like this. Off, now. You can call me Uchiha Sasuke. Until my death, I was one of Konoha's more notorious missing nin, but now I am a shinobi. I was murdered by Uchiha Madara when I was 19 years old. I passed away as my generation's strongest missing nin, the Uchiha matriarch. The man I loved and who had grown to love me was the target of my death. If I were to succeed this time, I would also do it again. In summary, I passed away. Then, without puberty, I woke up about 6 years before the fact. Since then, my life has been an exercise in frustration. I'm trying to gently win back Naruto's affections by teaching this poor young body of mine how to move, regaining control over the elements that I had long ago manipulated, and making myself even more crazy than I already am. Although I didn't do too badly in my initial quest for vengeance, I still have a lot of people to kill and will need to kill even more. I've only just started my journey. I'm Uchiha Sasuke, and I intend to murder Madara. Off, now, off, off, off. I'm Uchiha Sasuke, and I'm getting impatient very quickly. I resisted the urge to stab Naruto for what might have been the 100th time in the last 2 days and hopped off his back with a grumpy sigh. It was a loving and welcoming gesture, but I had to keep in mind that this Naruto wouldn't recognize it. Unlike the last time we met at the Valley of the End, he would not throw me down onto the stone and then do the same to me, most likely. Now that we're all here, Kakashi interrupted my introspective thoughts. How much do you three know about Konoha's founding? Everything. HN. Naruto asked more questions than he answered. The guy we're standing on did stuff with, trees, right? Kakashi patted the Shodai's neck and gave an encouraging nod. Kakashi gave Naruto a fleeting glance, something I would have missed entirely if I weren't exponentially more perceptive than I should have been at this age. Trees were part of it, but his bloodline was a little broader than that in scope. The wood release, Mokuton, allowed him to combine his water and earth affinities. We'll talk about affinities later, don't worry, Sakura. In order to create wood, it gave him all the flexibility of Suiden and Doden with neither of their drawbacks. His Mokuton also had the unprecedented ability to restrain the 9 Biju, which many would say is the primary reason for his legendary status. He was obviously mistaken. I scoffed a little despite myself because it was so ridiculously incorrect, but I didn't bring it up. In the end, it was a mere technicality, so it barely mattered. In due time, Naruto would reveal the truth to them. Kakashi added, of course, there was much more to him than that, and gave me a small smile. I gave a shrug. However, it might be best to begin at the beginning. Uchiha Madara and Senju Hashirama were born during the Warring Clans era, when taijutsu and kenjutsu predominated and ninjutsu and other modern arts had a supporting role. According to legend, Madara had the strongest Sharingan in the world and was the first matriarch her clan had ever seen. We have already discussed Hashirama, Sama's Mokuton, who was the Senju clan's patriarch. They were quite close, he concluded wryly. And that was a huge understatement. I've always questioned why. During the Warring Clans era, weren't their clans rivals? Sakura inquired, perplexed. Doubtlessly, Kakashi replied. But something like bad blood generally isn't a concern when love is involved. Sakura gasped and, as was to be expected, lit up with prepubescent glee at the idea of forbidden love, and I rolled my eyes. I looked sideways at Naruto to see his reaction to the revelation, but he was sitting cross-legged on the stone, back to us, and although he was close enough to be clearly listening, his eyes were just as clearly focused on the statue across from us. The statue of Uchiha Madara was as stunning and formidable as the woman herself. Her hair, so like mine would be in a few more years, blew up in wild, defiant spikes at the top of her head before tumbling down her back in wild, choppy waves, and her ancient armor embraced her slender figure around her arms and midsection to allow for unrestricted movement. People who are aware of the fact that my hair offends women worldwide have told me this more than once. However, whenever the subject was brought up, Naruto claimed to love it, so screw them. Shodai and Madara. Sakura inquired enthusiastically, I've never heard of that before. What took place? How, too? I can understand why your instructors at the academy might have glossed over it, Kakashi said, his laughter lacking in humor. In the end, it's not a very happy story. Naruto leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, thinking about the woman who killed him in a world I would never permit to exist again. It wasn't until it was too late that they came clean to each other. They were both too preoccupied with ensuring the survival of their respective clans during the conflict to secretly form an alliance. When Hashirama, Sama's younger brother, Tobirama, Sama, killed Madara's younger brother, Izuna, the situation became even more complicated. Sakura inhaled, the Nidaime, and Kakashi gave a nod. They both eventually grew so tired of the current situation that they unexpectedly declared their clans to be allies, surprising no one but themselves. They established Konoha with the grudging assistance of both clans, though Hashirama is credited with doing the majority of the work. As it turned out, that was the spark the rest of the world needed to move past the Warring Clans era, and dozens of different clans hurried to erect their own hidden villages in Konoha's image. We were the best example at the time, though, which is why so many talented shinobi clans decided to ally themselves with us in the beginning. Sounds like a happy ending, doesn't it? He sighed and began to tap his leg. Unfortunately, that wasn't quite the end of it. I whispered, Madara wanted to be Hokage, because I couldn't contain my disbelief any longer. What that foolish woman had thrown away for some useless robes and a hat still astounded me. She did. The majority of the village, however, preferred Hashirama Sama for the position. Even a portion of her own clan, although they never admitted it to her. Tobirama Sama was particularly vocal in his opposition, which swayed most of the neutral clans in Hashirama Sama's favor. And he sighed and cocked his head. Well, you all know which of them is carved into the Hokage mountain. Sakura inquired, what did Madara do, then? There are many understatements, such as, she didn't take it well. He paused, as if he was rethinking what he had said, but I knew for a fact that he had only said exactly what he meant to say. She defected, in the end, claiming that with Hashirama Sama as the Shodai Hokage and Tobirama Sama as his likely successor, the Uchiha clan would never receive the same considerations that the Senju did. And to be fair. Well, anyway, Hashirama Sama pursued her all the way to the edge of Hai no Kuni, where they clashed. He pointed to an arbitrary spot at the top of the waterfall while humming and squinting the one eye that was visible. There. He waved a hand at the valley below us and said, to put it succinctly, they started their battle on a level plane, and they ended it with this. Additionally, he said in a dry voice, in case you hadn't made the connection, they were very powerful. Sakura whispered, wow, as she gazed upon the valley with a renewed sense of reverence. Who won? No one, Naruto muttered. I squinted. How did Heya? I closed my eyes, unable to look at Sakura's rapt attention without feeling physically ill. Got it in one. Madara confessed her feelings for Hashirama Sama before either of them could deal a finishing blow. To her, this was merely historical drama, it wasn't authentic. Sakura gasped in horror, and Kakashi grimly nodded. Hashirama Sama admitted that he felt the same for her, to her joy, but before she could whisk him off on a likely permanent honeymoon, he also admitted that he was already engaged to another woman. Uzumaki Mito was the daughter of Uzu Shiogakure's clan head, as well as a master of Fuinjutsu, making her an ideal wife for Hashirama Sama. I noticed how Sakura's gaze shifted to Naruto when his last name was mentioned, if only she were aware. Hashirama Sama loved Madara, but he loved Konoha more, and in time he would come to love Mito Sama just as much. That, coupled with Madara's defection, meant they could never be together romantically. Sakura trailed off. What did she? I echoed, she didn't take it well. Not at all, concurred Kakashi. The pain of his rejection on top of the events that had forced her from Konoha in the first place ended up pushing her over the edge. She experienced something of a mental break, and fled from Hashirama Sama, tearfully declaring. With an explosive yawn, Naruto leaned back and used his palms to rub his eyes. His arms were stretched above his head, blinking blearily against the sun, and he said, sorry, sensei. Heat's starting to get to me. I'm gonna take a quick dip, wake myself up a bit. Was he crying? Before I could get a clear view, he jumped off the Shodai's shoulder and vanished into the waterfall, leaving no ripple to indicate his departure. I scowled as I replayed the fleeting glimpse of him in my mind and swore at myself for not having my Sharingan on to ingrain it in my memory. Tearfully declaring, Kakashi went on, his tone unusually solemn after Naruto's tirade, that she would not rest until she had wiped out the Uzumaki clan in its entirety for taking away the man she loved. In the silence that followed, he paused for a long time and sheepishly rubbed the back of his head, or so the story goes. Yes, exactly. That cunt was going to get killed by me. The actual mission started suddenly. We were pacing through Hai no Kuni's trees in silence 1 minute, with Kakashi seemingly happy to let us absorb his tale at our own speed, and then the Jonin brought us to a complete stop. Observing the raised hand he had used to stop us, I sat elegantly on one of the weaker branches. My heart started to race, in stark contrast to the cool neutrality I was trying so hard to maintain. Now, it wouldn't be long. 1 more second before he found the trail. He said softly, someone just stumbled into an ambush, without making any movement. A rather nasty one, if I'm not mistaken. Sakura let out a gasp. Wah. Who? This is Hai no Kuni. We're closer to the border than you might think, actually, Kakashi said, dismissively gesturing with his hand. I can't tell who is who from this distance. I'd have to get closer. What say you three? I pondered the question for a moment. This was novel. The first time around, Kakashi hadn't bothered to ask if we wanted to assist. Naruto said, let's help them, right away. Kakashi bowed his head and then turned to face me with anticipation. I grinned, just a little. HN. Perhaps it was just my wishful thinking, but it sounded more like a formality than anything else when Kakashi asked the last team member, Sakura? He had already decided on something. Still, apprehensive but determined, Sakura answered, we have to at least check, don't we? Kakashi grinned broadly and said, then we're decided, to all of us. Follow along behind me, and try to keep pace, children, he said before fading away to the east at a blur. Naruto roared, come on, guys, and I let myself unwind as life returned to him. Let's kick some ass. Finding them at the speed Kakashi said didn't take long. Only a few minutes after our sudden stop, I exploded from the treetops onto a public road, bringing everything into sharp focus and Sharingan spinning to life in my eyes. Before he had even crossed the tree line, Naruto was just a few seconds behind me, belting out Kage Bunshin. The total number of shinobi present was just over a dozen. 8 of them were dressed in the faded reds and browns of Iwa, while 5 Konoha shinobi were dressed in traditional Chunin attire. It didn't matter that 2 of the Konoha Chunin were already down and most likely dead. With bare anger on their faces, the other 2 were vehemently protesting the Iwa contingency. Then everything turned orange as Naruto jumped past me and into the battle. Just as Sakura landed on the branch next to me, I smirked broadly and shook my head before pushing away. Sasuke! She exclaimed, her voice almost lost in the din of battle cries as Naruto's clones screamed into the atmosphere. What do I do? Watch. With each sweep of my Chikuto, my blood sang as I joyfully tore through the throng of clones. At last, I sliced through a clone with an Iwa Nin on the opposite side. When he turned to face me and bared his teeth, the tomo in each of my eyes whirled with anticipation. He towered over me, head and shoulders high. A crimson Iwa headband was tied securely to his brown hair, which was cropped close to his head. I threw aside any additional observations in favor of lunging forward and burying my Chikuto in his throat, even though he was wearing some kind of flak jacket. Naturally, he dodged, and I was momentarily taken aback. I grinned savagely as I realized my Sharingan was still immature. Well, this was more enjoyable anyhow. When he appeared ready to start a jutsu, I let the weak copies knock him off balance with gut punches and tackles, but otherwise I dispelled them with my dancing blade, driving him back into the crowd of clones. I was going to relish the fact that this was the first real battle I had had since my transmigration. He appeared to be an expert in both ninjutsu and taijutsu because, after being stopped mid-jutsu for the first 30 seconds or so, he completely gave up and charged me. My Sharingan whirled ever faster, and my smile grew wider, revealing teeth. As he shoved me out of the crowd and swung me around with big, showy punches that made me think of the strong fist, I fell to the back foot. 1 part crushing force, 1 part intimidation. Every component is susceptible. A length of razor. Thin wire sprang across the open air between us as swiftly as a snake when I flicked my left hand at the wrist. I threw his guard wide open with a deft yank after it coiled around his right arm and overextended in a positively sloppy punch. I widened my eyes and sprang forward, punching my Chikuto cleanly through the heart while spinning in a half circle to gain momentum. Iwa Nin without names looked down at me with about the same level of horror and shock that any Iwa Nin would have experienced upon seeing me. Or, for that matter, any Kiri Nin. Well, Kumo. My sword came free with a quick thrust to his chest, and my wire came loose with a final wrist flick, coiling dutifully around my wrist. That was 1. I looked for enemy corpses in the chaos Naruto had dumped on the battleground and found 1, 2, 3, and 4. 5 people dead, including me. Already? I hurried back into the battle. I had no idea that I would leave this with anything less than 3. Sakura begged, Naruto, please calm down. Let me at her, Naruto growled, his enraged sky-blue eyes glaring at me. Just this once, just for a second, I arched my eyebrow. Not worth it, yelled the Naruto clone on the right, straining to keep the original in his grasp. The clone of Naruto on the left agreed, trying just as hard to restrain his creator. She'll make it weird, he said. She burned my stuff, Sakura insisted. I'm sure she didn't do it on purpose. I was tempted to contradict her by telling the truth, but I thought it was a little too soon to play my hand. I heard Naruto say, bullshit. The fight was over and she knew it, more to me than to her. He stopped thrashing long enough to give the clone a sidelong glance. Hey, that hurts. Clone on the left repositioned his grip and said, sorry boss. Better? Yeah, that's fine. I said, I'm very sorry for burning your belongings, Naruto, lowering my head just enough to avoid being accused of making fun of him. However, Naruto always understood. Please, allow me to repay you however you see fit. He ground out, You. And I felt like laughing. Stupid error, dead last. I said quietly, you want me? And let my laughter come through when his clones started to vehemently deny it. Soon after the detour to the Valley of the End, I had made the decision that feigning to be a conventional love interest was just too much work for too little reward, and I proceeded with my preparations accordingly. I didn't need to put on a front to win his heart. I would just need to be a little more straightforward, it seemed. Kakashi called from his home down the road, where he had been discussing the reason for their ambush and the remaining Konoha nin. Ma, could you three spare your sensei a moment? I squinted when I saw the client, a small, middle-aged noble who was sagging under the weight of his pricey jewelry and robes. What hair he had left was turning quickly to gray, and he was going bald. His eyes were sharp and green, but they were filled with paranoia rather than intelligence, at least that's what I modestly believe. Even if I hadn't already met him the first time, his weathered skin and odd attire would have given me a clue as to where he came from. As we Wakeda, or, in Naruto's case, were dragged over to the adults, Kakashi proposed, how about we introduce ourselves? This is Akira Miura, Kei's no Kuni's noble, devoted companion and one of the Wind Daimyo's numerous advisors. Walking Dead Man. A pleasure to meet you, he said warmly after we had exchanged names. It is certainly reassuring to see the next generation of Konoha's shinobi is so skilled. Why, I don't know what we would have done without your intervention. To my surprise, Sakura was the only one who waved the praise away, even though she tried her best to do so for the three of us. Naruto, who was extremely shy around such things, merely gave the foreign noble some thought. I had the impression that Kakashi was observing all of us at once as I watched him observe Miura, until he appeared to make a choice. Once he nodded, and smoke rose from the clones on either side of him. He asked the three Chunin who were hanging back, avoiding the noble at all, is there anything we can do for your teammates? Another placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and one of them winced, turning streaked cheeks away from his worried blue eyes. The third let out a sigh. Nothing we haven't already tried, they're gone. I had just given him a faintly mocking brand, but Naruto immediately bowed his head in a real bow. I'm sorry we didn't come sooner. He was, too. I let out a silent sigh as the gesture's emotion softened something inside of me. There were times when it was just too hard to mess with him. However, I guess he also made loving him equally simple. Following a brief period of hesitation, the Chunin who had answered Naruto's initial query bowed his head in return. Naruto's jaw clenched as he tried to contain his response. You did your best. We could not possibly ask you anything more. In the echoes of my memory, I could already hear it. Of course you can. I was supposed to keep you safe, but I didn't. You must request more from me. Even now, he was a complete idiot. Kakashi interjected softly, we've been discussing a few things. Kubota-san, Yosano-san, and Tetsuno-san are part of a team that Miura-san hired to accompany him on his travels through Hai no Kuni, before escorting him back to Kei's no Kuni's capital. The obvious senior of the three Chunin stated wearily, we had about 2 more weeks of travel time scheduled before the escort back to Kei's no Kuni. However, when Miura said, I am quite ready to return, she spoke quickly. The senior Chunin nodded gratefully, saying, given the recent events, I would prefer not to burden you any longer than is necessary. Kakashi pointed to the junior Chunin and remarked, which brings us to the current situation. Kubota-san doesn't feel he's in the proper condition to finish the mission. And Tetsuno-san would like Yasuno-san to accompany him back to Konoha along with their teammates. Their dead bodies. He's asked for our assistance in completing the mission, in case another incident occurs. Tetsuno, the senior member, clarified, I want to think this was just a case of us being at the wrong part of the border at the wrong time. He grimaced as he ran a hand through his shoulder. Length, straight hair. He grinned wryly and said, but I feel much better with Hitaki-san present. And yourselves, of course. Kakashi clapped his hands together and exclaimed, so, fortunately, he did not vanish in a body flicker this time. What do you say? I wondered what to say next without coming across as overly interested, but fortunately Naruto was ahead of me. With conviction, he said, we'll do it, and Sakura's teeth clicked shut around her next words. She gave me a curious look. We were going, of course. There was a lot more to be done. Fine, I replied. Sakura seemed to find that sufficient. Miura exclaimed, wonderful, wonderful. He would soon be unable to forget or recall much of anything at all, but I didn't say that. You have my sincerest thanks, Shinobi of Konoha. I won't forget this, I assure you, but I wanted to. Kakashi walked away from the group and motioned for the 2 junior Chunin to follow him. Yes, he said. I'm going to see if I can't provide a few guides for our friends before they set out for Konoha. In the meanwhile, why don't you three help Tatsuno-san find a suitable place to set up camp? Yes, sensei, Sakura dutifully answered. Naruto started to nod obligingly, but then he froze, his eyes widening in rage. The sight of it sent a little thrill through me. You burnt my tent, bastard. As a result, I made the selfless decision to let Naruto spend the night in my tent a few hours later, after dusk had finally set in on our tiny campsite. Of course, with me still in it. I sat calmly inside my sleeping bag and asked, well, are you coming in or not? As he waffled around outside, Naruto paused, his gaze fixed on the thin black undershirt I had stripped down to. He took a swallow. You know, maybe I'll just keep watch for tonight. Can't be too careful, nay, he said, turning and practically jumping through my tent's opening. Halfway through the opening, my voice screamed, Naruto. It was like a sharp whip crack that stopped him cold. I let out a sigh and slightly lowered my voice. I burnt your tent. Please use mine. Yeah, alright. With the demeanor of a vanquished samurai, he ducked back into the tent. He tried to sprawl out in the corner, but there wasn't much space for anything but my sleeping bag because it was just an individual tent. Despite myself, I rolled my eyes in amusement. Just get in the sleeping bag, idiot. But, you, Ga, he exclaimed, raising his hands. Fine. My blonde fool shimmied defiantly inside my sleeping bag with me, tossing his sandals, headband, and jacket into the same corner he had just been attempting to huddle himself into. He immediately turned away from me, trying to avoid making as much contact as he could. I grinned and shook my head. This time around, there were a lot of things that would be different between the two of us. Considering the modifications I intended to make, it couldn't be the same. I was therefore very likely to recreate the experiences that I was able to. Back when there wasn't really anything between us, this was one of the first. He had practically forced himself into mine because I had accidentally burned his tent the first time. This time, it was a little different, if only because I had started to treat him differently, but it was sufficient. I moved my bare legs, rubbing them up against him and stretching them just so. I suppressed a laugh as he tensed up. Naruto eventually calmed down and fell asleep, and I was there as soon as he turned over. I moved and wriggled against him, laughing at the idea of him waking up to the feeling, until I was lying more or less in his arms. I melted into him, burying my head in the bend of his neck and letting out a hysterical sigh of relief. I relaxed for the first time in, well, I don't know how long. Indeed, this was more than sufficient. I had trouble falling asleep. Since my transmigration, I have been constantly moving, enhancing my strengths and whittling away at my weaknesses, clawing for every hour with the focused mania of a man who meant to save the world. I might as well be Uzumaki in human form, but that doesn't mean I don't sleep. The Uzumaki have always had a vitality that is different from that of the typical shinobi. Like everyone else, I need time to relax and rejuvenate. I've been surviving on meditation thus far because I'm determined to make the little time I spend relaxing at least somewhat useful. A 12-year-old has no right to meditate or have more chakra. Together, these elements have enabled me to endure weeks of physical strain that my present body had never experienced before, but they were insufficient. Fatigue had become ingrained in my thoughts and behavior, and it was gaining ground on me every day. Looking back, I think it might have been wiser to get a little sleep each day instead of waiting for my first mission to let me go. Anyway, a saner idea. However, since I had already made my bed, my only option was to sleep there for as long as Kakashi would allow me before it was time to leave. Fortunately, the worst of the damage would be undone in a few hours. I would get by, but it wasn't going to be enjoyable. Well, if I'd been able to sleep at all, I would have managed. In my arms, Sasuke felt cool, soft, and unbearably cozy. She breathed in my scent as her slightly upturned nose twitched against my neck, where my hair and nude skin met. She let out a sigh of satisfaction. Or perhaps she was simply breathing. It was kind of hard to tell between the exhaustion and the crippling self-loathing. Before I rolled over and tried to see if my other side would have any luck, I couldn't recall how long I had been lying in the explicitly single sleeping bag, trying and failing to give in to the fatigue. All I knew was that Sasuke was immediately burying himself in my arms as soon as I did. Damn me for a fool, I had frozen, and she was already curled up against me when I regained consciousness. And now that she was asleep and I wasn't, I found it impossible to let her go. If anything, in the hours since she'd fallen asleep, my arms had gotten even tighter around her. At this age, Sasuke was a good few inches taller than me, but she felt so tiny curled up with her face buried in my neck and her legs entangled in mine. She was 13 and I wasn't, so I couldn't hold on to her any longer and had to let her go. In a fit of rage and poisonous despair, I clenched my teeth and bit back a snarl, as Kurama responded to my negative emotions by pushing the tainted chakra through my seal. My vision flashed a dark, bloody red. I found myself hiding in Sasuke's hair to escape the agony of it all after a ridiculous sense of betrayal struck me in the same place that the exhaustion and hopeless longing had been gnawing at me for weeks. With a shaky exhale, I threw my will against the bloody chakra frothing out of my seal and blocked out everything else, releasing a sea of silken midnight strands. I no longer had nature on my side, so it was much harder than I remembered, and it hurt even more because I no longer detested the force behind it. I realized that Kurama was not the villain I had long believed him to be. Since we had never been friends in this timeline, I also knew that what he was doing now was neither evil nor betrayal. It was merely vindictive, and it was really painful. After a few agonizing seconds, I arched up when the first wave of chakra struck me, and I slumped back as the last of Kurama's chakra retreated behind my seal. I lay there feeling sorry for myself for a long time before I flopped back down and realized I had taken Sasuke with me. She was sleeping happily now, stretched out on my chest, her hair gathered around us both. As my hand cautiously moved from around her back to brush along the ragged black strands protruding at the top of her head, I noticed my lips quivering into a sweet little smile. Sasuke's hair has always appealed to me. It was messy, frantic in a way that was just right for her. If you were to look at it, you would think it could break glass, but I firmly believe that nothing was softer in the world. There were a lot of sharp edges and spikes that flared up at the top of her head and then fell in wild black waves down her back. It would only grow more unbridled over time. She had no intention of wasting time on something as unimportant as keeping her hair in order. I threaded a few strands through my fingers and laughed quietly. Then I became aware of my actions. I slowly withdrew my hand from her hair as I froze, barely daring to breathe. If I could just take the other arm off of her waist and leave the tent, I might be able to sleep at last. Desperate, I put my arm back around my teammate. I had trouble falling asleep. The ghost of the woman I loved was too strong for me to let go of. And I was unable to persuade myself that I desired anything more than Uchiha Sasuke in this silent, solitary moment when there was nothing else to divert my attention. I muttered, "You were wrong, Madara," blinking quickly to quell the glare in my eyes as memories of heartbroken Uchiha women reappeared in the tent's shadow. This time, it wasn't a chakra burn. Only a few tears of frustration. I don't deserve her. So I desperately clung to Sasuke. Knowing I wouldn't sleep a wink, I made the decision to rest. In the end, when these valuable hours might be the last, I wouldn't allow myself to hold her in this way close, cozy, and right. I really didn't regret returning. I wish it weren't lonely, though. Esriver ni Netter W. The land of rivers, or Kawa no Kuni, was a peculiar country. Being a direct neighbor of the land of fire, Konoha received a fair amount of work from their people on a fairly regular basis. For a variety of reasons, I've been there more than once. Escorts, courier services, etc. Normally, I also don't mind. The nation is stunning. The fact that my first 2 trips there were such complete disasters isn't really the nation's fault. The land of rivers was peculiar because it had large borders with Konoha and Suna, the 2 countries that were home to great hidden villages, respectively, but it interacted with Aim, its third neighbor, much more frequently. There were many theories as to why this had suddenly changed more than 10 years ago, and it hadn't always been this way. I knew who the man responsible for the sudden change was, but I couldn't tell you what those theories were because who cares? Nagato Uzumaki. Or Pain, as the rest of the world called him. My cousin, the merciless leader of Akatsuki, and the god king of Aim. Or perhaps my uncle. I never had the opportunity to inquire. The main idea is that Pain had decided he didn't like Aim's current allies and channels after he viciously killed the organization's previous leader and took control of it. He therefore created his own. Although it didn't seem significant at the time, he had at least single-handedly established the land of rivers as a major trading hub and a host country for at least half a dozen Akatsuki hideouts, of which I destroyed 6. I never learned the full extent of his influence there, but there might have been more. If he hadn't lost so many lives in the process of creating the unofficial alliance, I would have been impressed. Tanigakure was once a secret village in the land of rivers. Coincidentally, it shifted the majority of its business to Pain's village and disappeared at the same time that its host nation began to favor Aim. And that wasn't all. Though perhaps not as unsettling, Kawa no Kuzi's peculiarity extended beyond its status as an unofficial puppet nation. Sakura looked out over the cliffside and said, "Sensei," in a curious tone, "what are those?" The caverns were there. There were surprisingly many rivers in the land of rivers. These rivers flowed, and they flowed fiercely, in contrast to the majority of the channels we had in the Land of Fire. After innumerable centuries, this led to cliff faces that had been eroded by time and water. Nature washed away by unrelenting currents, both above and below ground. Caves carved out by the encroaching freshwater fingers of the sea. I never really liked the Land of Rivers because its underground caverns were its most distinctive feature. There were caverns everywhere, and they represented nature overtaken by the elements. The rivers themselves ebbed and flowed over time, but they ran deeper than some of them. Sasuke, of course, adored it for the same reason. Sakura's question was met with a sneer from Kunoichi. Her words, "their caves." Fortunately, it wasn't too venomous because the atmosphere of the place was already affecting her. In any case, Sakura blushed slightly. "Well, I know that, but aren't they bigger than most caves?" I concurred, "They're pretty huge." In her retort, Sasuke paused and turned her slightly shaded eyes toward me. "Yes, don't speak." "Oh no. They're one of the more famous natural phenomena around," Kakashi remarked, pointing to a powerful water current that was pouring into the caverns below with his porn. "The rivers here are strong, and over time they've carved out more than a few of those caverns. If you were to go down and follow that stream, you'd get a lot further than you might think." I hoped that was the case, but man. After the previous 3 days of travel, we had arrived at a sort of turning point. Since our client was a civilian who was far from in his prime, we hadn't been moving very quickly, but we had still covered ground. A few hours earlier, the boundaries of the Land of Fire had shifted, giving way to rising terrain with a more manageable number of trees. I suppose the caves were so far below us because we had been on an incline for some time. Miura said, "They're spectacular, aren't they?" The small civilian gestured enthusiastically as he continued on a digression that I vaguely remembered from before my transmigration. "I know more than one adventurous soul whose travels have taken them beneath the surface of this country, and you wouldn't believe some of their stories." I ignored him while I scratched at an itch that had persisted for the last hour or so. Possibly Sasuke's eyes on the back of my head are a sign of impending confrontations. Because I didn't know much about our surprise client, I wasn't sure how to handle him. My understanding of what he would do was far more extensive than my understanding of who he was, and this did not give me a positive impression of him. I've resorted to neutrality for the time being, which for me meant disregarding him like he was past due. He was handling it much better than Sasuke, with whom I had chosen to keep my distance following my panic attack in her tent. As I tried my best to be the silently contemptuous person she used to be to Maya, something she obviously wasn't used to and didn't enjoy, this had resulted in more than a few awkward moments. Sincerely, I was now keeping track of the minutes until she reacted and attempted to murder me. That was going to be a moot point soon enough, which was fortunate for my nerves, if not for my health. I said, "Hey Tetsuno," without giving it much thought because it was a reverberation from 6 years ago. "We almost there?" Moving some of his shoulder length hair out of his eyes, the seasoned Chunin hummed as he looked down at the rivers below, hoping to spot a familiar landmark. After a few seconds, he located it. "At this pace, we have one more night before we reach the coast. From there, it should only take us a day of steady sailing to reach the capital." I shuddered as the well-known words sent a shiver down my spine. "Nearly there. It's almost time to play. Are we going with you guys?" Tetsuno grinned ruefully and said, "If it's possible, I'll try my hardest to get you credited for a B-rank mission as soon as we get home. We owe you a lot." Kakashi said, "Ma, there's no need for that much flattery," before I could dismiss the man. He challenged us all to disagree, quirking his eye in a joyful crescent. "I'm sure my cute little students are more than happy with the C-rank pay they were promised. Isn't that right, you three?" he asked. I froze after halfway through a witty retort. Our sensei had changed. There was a faint but noticeable tension in his demeanor that made my heart race and my adrenaline run high. Sasuke also became aware of it, adjusting her posture slightly to make her Chikuto's hilt easily accessible. "Formation," was all he said. I took a step to the right when Sasuke took a step to the left, bringing us closer to Miura, who stopped abruptly a step behind us. Sakura blinked as she glanced between our sensei and us, but then she felt the tension in the air and quickly rushed behind us, taking her place behind the client. Tetsuno stepped up next to the surprisingly at ease Genin and said, "Hitaki-san," in a low voice. "I don't sense anything." "Give it a moment." Just a few seconds before the Chunin did, I sensed it, and the intensity of it gave me another little chill. I had forgotten how it felt because it had been so long. That constant, oppressive pressure, telling me that I was running out of time and that the hourglass of my life would soon run out of sand. The physical force of Gara's intent to kill us swept over us, knocking Miura to the ground as his legs failed him and even causing our Chunin companion to take a startled step back. Gara's desire to completely destroy us repeatedly swept over Sakura, causing her to gasp and tremble. I conjured up 2 clones, each of whom stood watch on Sakura's flank. When they took hold of her hands, she recoiled, but they held fast, and the worst of the tremors eventually subsided. With a trembling sigh, she forced herself to stop the deadly attack. With relief, bewilderment, and perhaps even thankfulness vying for control in her eyes, she turned to face me. As my clones reassured her by squeezing her hands, I gave her a quick smile. "We'll be fine, Sakura." According to Sasuke, they're here, with narrowed eyes. From the forest spread out less than a mile ahead of us, the siblings emerged first. On top of her fan, Temari exploded into the air, riding a controlled windstorm across the open plain between us and the forest. Next was Kankuro, who hurried behind his sister after darting out of the trees. Then there was a lurch in the forest, and sand poured out of the trees as thick and raging as the rivers at the base of the cliff. I flinched as I saw it completely rip some of the smaller trees from their roots. It surged across the field, twisting and slashing at random points in the direction of Temari and Kankuro, who managed to stay just a few precious steps ahead of it until they suddenly stopped 10 yards from us. As they flowed back to their master, the waves of sand ate them and then split apart as swiftly as they had come, trembling with Gara's suppressed desire to murder. The children and sensei of the case cage followed, looking at us with differing degrees of professional disinterest. Temari crossed her arms over her light lavender battle dress, surveyed us coolly, and flipped her dark blonde hair deftly to chase a few stray grains of sand from her person. From under the hood of his black catsuit, Kankuro crouched and sneered at us. Under the cloth veil that seemed to complete most traditional Suna uniforms, their sensei, a man I vaguely remembered as Baki, grimly met Kakashi's one-eyed stare with his own. And Gara, well, he was generally insane and kind of stood there killing us with his eyes. I mumbled, "Here we go," clenching and unclenching my fists intermittently. When my fellow Jinchuriki's deadly jade eyes met mine, I felt a wild smile spread across my lips. "Gara, just wait. Change is on the horizon," Baki said, Hitaki Kakashi, ending the tense silence that had preceded their arrival. "You are in possession of an enemy of the state. As friends of Suna, we ask that you surrender Miura Akira immediately." Tetsuno jerked, his face tinged with anger, but Kakashi held up a hand to calm him. He said lightly, "Greetings, Baki," and the Suna Jonin bowed his head gravely. "May we see some proof of Miura-san's guilt?" From his spot on the ground, Miura exclaimed, Hitaki-san, as he looked fearfully between Gara and our sensei. Kakashi ignored him courteously. Baki said, "We have only our orders from the case cage," and he produced a small scroll bearing the case cage's seal and ringed with a bright blue band from his flak jacket. He threw it to Kakashi, who caught it and, with a single, fluid wrist snap, unfurled it. He sighed as his single eye skimmed over the contents. He told Tetsuno, "Well, this is awkward," and motioned for him to give him his own mission scroll. He threw them both back to Baki, who proceeded to read the Konoha scroll with the scarlet rings just as quickly. "We're duty bound to deliver Miura-san to the capital, alive if possible. The terms of our alliance were never officially agreed upon," Kakashi said with a smooth transition. "I don't suppose you'd like to accompany us to the capital, and proceed from there?" "Unacceptable," Baki's first response was. "We've reached an impasse, then," I said solemnly, just before Kakashi could. I was too excited to react when he arched an eyebrow at me. I was bouncing every foot in the process. "So, which one of you is getting it first?" Really, there was no use in asking. He was shaking now, wanting to splatter me across the plains, and I knew damn well who was getting it first. Gara questioned, "Can I kill him?" But it was unclear to whom or what he was referring. Baki frowned. The Jonin from Suna stated, "I won't ask a third time," with a faint undertone of urgency. "Give us the noble, Hitaki." Kakashi remarked, Ma, let's not get hasty, I'm sure we can come to some sort of agreement here." "I'm going to kill him," Gara said in a whisper while grinning icily at me. I gladly gave it back. A tendril of sand that Gara had been slowly feeding through the grass whipped out at my heart as Sasuke hissed and darted sideways, crashing into my side and sending us both sprawling. After encircling her in my arms and transforming our rolling tumble into a backward somersault, I gracefully stood up and released her to perform a simple little seal by crossing my fingers. Taiju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, and I brought more clones to the plains than Gara had sand grains. Kakashi gave a frustrated shake of his head. Then, in a furious round of steel against steel, he blurred across the plains and said, "You children. As I darted between bright orange cloth and grabbing sand, my heart thumping an angry drum against my chest, I plunged into the roiling mass of clones. It was this. At last, I could start the first phase of my plan. I was going to save the world from now on. Pain, eat your heart out, this one was going to be successful. Finally, the time had come. I was finally able to let go. With a crackling scream, my Chikuto escaped its sheath, lightning rushing wildly down the edge of the blade. I let out a long, contented sigh. I blinked, and my vision suddenly became clear in the brief darkness, my immature Sharingan pooling to crimson life in my eyes. Amid the confusion, I selected my first target, the oldest daughter with the absurd quadruple ponytail, after surveying the orgy of orange shinobi that Naruto had dropped on the field. My mouth twisted. "Sasuke!" exclaimed Sakura, "we're supposed to defend the client." I waved my empty hand at the Chunin tagalong, who appeared to be undecided about joining the fight or staying behind with the client. I said to him, "It's his client. He can guard with you," and I made the choice. Then, before the closest clone could adjust to my weight, I jumped up onto its shoulders, crouching and pushing off, quickly dispelling it. Really, Naruto had created far too many clones. There were hundreds of them, and once they were crowded into a small space, they became annoying distractions rather than effective fighters. It was a respectable strategy in and of itself, but Naruto had already enraged me with it several times before I became proficient enough at slicing through their ranks that it made no difference. However, I had a feeling that Naruto wasn't quite at that level of thought yet. At least it provided good traction. I dispelled more than a dozen clones that I used as stepping stones on my way to the sky as I flew up the actual mountains of clones stacked one on top of the other. While it wasn't yet on par with my Chidorigatana, my Chikuto was chirping frantically the entire time. Directly beneath the oldest daughter, I believe it was named Temeria, I exploded into the open air and slashed out, making a simple cut on the paper of the fan she had taken off with. My blade's chirruping was my giveaway, giving the other kunoichi a valuable opportunity to jerk the fan's heavy metal into my path. Just as easily as I would have cut through the paper, my blade sliced a clean furrow through the heavily plated steel. Grasping the base of her battle fan tightly, Temari hissed something poisonous at me and slid out of sight. She yanked the fan out from beneath her, twisted in midair, and swung it down at me with a shout of effort as I was just starting to fall. I flashed through 6 quick seals as gale force winds howled directly at me from its edges. "Hosenka no Jutsu," Kaden said. One after the other, I spat out 7 balls of fire as wide as I was tall, and each one lost momentum as it collided with the unnamed wind jutsu. Under my careful direction, the last fireball smashed into the flailing mass of flames and lost control due to the wind, returning to the Suna Kunoichi. Temari hurled herself rapidly away from the flames, swinging her fan beneath her once more. The mass of clones had shrunk considerably since my climb, and I dropped back into it. Then Gara was getting things done quickly. As a whipping lance of sand tore through the clones toward me, I twisted at the waist, severing it and sending the sliced pieces flying with a lash of my lightning-covered blade. I landed on the shoulders of another clone and flew to the edge of the battleground, where I had spotted the middle sibling lurking in the open. To my amusement, Gara growled somewhere below in increasing annoyance. Naruto's clones appeared to be pushing his opponent over the edge more quickly than they were being eliminated. Hanging back at the edge of the fight was Kankuro, the middle sibling with the makeup. To get his puppet through the chaos of Naruto and Gara's fight and perform a play on the client, his right hand's fingers intertwined in intricate movements, steering it with gleaming strings of chakra. He was so focused on the delicate chakra technique that he was costing a clean retreat when he heard my blade chirping a moment later than his sister. I delivered a powerful blow, and my Chikuto sliced through the Suna Nin's palm from the base to the tip of his middle finger, numbing muscles with lightning and separating flesh from bone. Halfway across the field, his puppet clattered to the ground in a heap of wooden parts and metal weapons, and his hand went limp as my chakra moved down his arm. Shaking his arm wildly in a futile attempt to dispel my residual chakra, he swore. With a sly smile, I turned my blade around and hurried in to take advantage of the distraction. After a few seconds, I turned away and evaluated the field while flicking scarlet blood from my crackling blade. Behind me, Kankuro was lying bloody and crumpled, his chest trembling as he struggled to breathe through the paralysis I had induced in each of his limbs and other non-lethal spots on his torso. I wouldn't be the one to carry out the last act, but only time would tell if he could recover from the paralysis and bleeding. I wouldn't make things more complicated by killing one of the youngest Jinchuriki's siblings because Gara had been one of Naruto's best friends and would be again if the blonde idiot had anything to say about it. At any rate, not directly. Ascending the unstable tiers of clones and searching for another glimpse of Temari, I created the seal for the body flicker around the hilt of my Chikudo and sped back into the mass of clone and sand that was quickly turning more sand than clone. As it swept past, I saw a glimpse of her fan and changed my speed accordingly. Just before I launched myself into the open, I heard a shrill scream from below, and I halted on the shoulders of a vengeful clone as the tower of orange below trembled with the thunderous sound of sand hitting earth. Gara threw his arms back and forth like a deranged conductor leading a bloody concerto, furiously exclaiming, "Why won't you bleed?" His sand jumped at his command, tearing through clones with ever more ingenious shapes. Snapping jaws, razor sharp claws, and his own clones that somehow appeared even more insane than he did, but really, who was I to speak? Quickly ripped through Naruto's clones, making it even more difficult for me to keep my footing. But none of them detected anything but smoke from chakras. I erupted into the air as that same breathy sound from weeks earlier bubbled up to my lips. For a single frozen moment, my Chikudo went silent, and I looked around idly to make sure everything was in order. Sakura, Tatsuno, and the customer were where they had been a minute before, while Kakashi and Baki were slicing in and out of sight a little while away. Fierce hand.to, hand combat, lightning, and wind were tearing up the surrounding area and destroying any clones that happened to approach too closely. Satisfied with the state of the field, I nodded to myself. Then I used punishing force to slam into Temari's blind spot. With a gasp, the physically older Kunoichi reached for the base of her fan, sending chakra spiraling along its edges, giving the tomo spinning in my eyes a vivid teal shimmer. It's too late, too little. As I stabbed down at the sail holding us up, I jerked her hand away from the fan and slashed an arm around her throat, urging lightning to flow along my blade once more. I made a clean swing, creating a very thin line in the fan's paper that was quickly blown wide open by the winds that had been keeping us afloat. Below us, Temari's fan lurched, falling toward the sand and clones that waited in an open maw. Tamari arching her back in a futile attempt to escape, she fought frantically against my hold on her neck. She pulled a kunai from the heavy red sash around her waist and stabbed it at my arm since she had nothing else to do. I clucked in her ear and swiped my Chikudo contemptuously to knock it out of her hand. She sputtered something extremely offensive against my chokehold, and I scowled, offended. Now, I don't like you quite like that. That wasn't very nice. Fuck you, Tamari growled, her teeth clenched. She was thrown off the fan by me. As I carefully piloted her mangled fan away, the Suna Kunoichi inhaled deeply and screamed various sulfuric things at me. She was interrupted mid-insult to my cup size by the sand, and I pitifully turned my back on her predicament. I could no longer control it. There wasn't really anything I could do if her murderous younger brother happened to squeeze the blood from her still beating heart during the chaos of the altercation, was there. With an application of wind chakra that required much more focus than I'd like to acknowledge it. In fact, it would have been completely impossible for me. Only a few weeks ago I forced Temari's frayed fan past the writhing mass of sand. Nevertheless, I succeeded, avoiding the surprisingly silent conflict between the Genin sensei of the two teams, which was nearly as evenly matched as the previous time. From what I could see, Kakashi had the upper hand, but it wasn't nearly conclusive enough to defeat Baki. Yes, came Gara's voice from below, followed by a terrified yell as he used a viciously barbed sand tendril to knock down a lone orange-clad shinobi. Sakura yelled, "Naruto!" from the other side of the plains, and I hurled Temari's fan into the air. The fight's second phase was about to begin. The real challenge is about to begin. I threw myself into a spin and pushed as much bright blue lightning through my Chikudo as my coils could handle, leaping from the fan a good 24 at eye level with the faraway treetops. Under my blade, the sand split like warm butter, and the resulting shockwave of condensed lightning blasted the half of the strand that had been severed away from my blonde fool. Without the Chidori, a Chidori Nagashi. Sasuke? Asked Naruto, puzzled. When did you learn lightning transformation? I grinned. When did you learn what lightning transformation was, dead last? A dozen yards away, Gara snarled, swinging his arm as though to backhand me. What are you doing? He's mine, Gara said. I rushed it to useless grains with another brief discharge, but his sand was more than happy to comply. I repressed my excitement, calmed my breathing, and strengthened my remaining chakra. At this age, my chakra reserves were even more deplorable than I had recalled. I had limited myself to simple lightning manipulation so far because I could only use the Chidori 2 or 3 times as I was now. For now, it would have to be sufficient. No, I replied. No, littlest Jinchuriki, he is mine. I would never give him up, and he would always be mine, never again, never again. Oh, sighed Naruto. Oh, Don't move, I instructed him. I can't afford to keep track of you. This would undoubtedly require all of my remaining chakra and focus. Without killing him or rendering him unconscious and letting the Ichibi loose, I had to render him incapacitated. Additionally, I had to stay away from his worst sand lest it destroy me the way it had in the past. Enough! Gara yelled, holding his head in one hand while wildly waving the other. I tensed, Tomo spinning ferociously in my eyes, and brought my hands together in the seal for the body flicker, saying, "Mother wants blood. She'll have you both." And stopped when my wrist was clamped down by a firm hand. In some confusion, I glanced down at my lightly tanned fingers, trying and failing to make sense of this interruption in relation to my memories. Looking back at Naruto incredulously, I threw back another wave of sand with my Chikudo, almost as an afterthought. "What are you doing?" He just stared back at me in disbelief for a moment without saying anything. "You've already got the Sharingan," he replied. "How did I not see?" He interrupted, releasing my wrist and burying his face in his hand while he laughed incoherently. "Naruto. Why did you stop me?" Still laughing, he shook his head and gestured over Gaara's shoulder and past me. Step 1. I was about to yell at him when I heard the sound of chakra grinding against chakra, but the words escaped my lips. The clone pointed a finger at the roiling wall of sand that was in Gaara's blind spot, and I spun, following it. That was not feasible. That was new to him. He was not yet able to know that. Nevertheless, a sphere of chakra light that shone brightly in my eyes like the sun replaced the sand wall, which shuddered. Rasengan. As his last line of defense crumbled under the power of the Yondaime Hokage's final creation, Gara turned around, eyes wide open. With his Rasengan drawn back like a javelin, Naruto sped through the opening. In my eyes, the Tomo whirled wildly, looking everywhere at his face, his demeanor, everything for evidence that he was the 12-year-old he seemed to be, seeking an explanation for how he could have known a jutsu that he couldn't possibly know. Naruto yelled, "Be my friend, motherfucker," and pummeled Gaara's face with the Rasengan. A beat skipped in my chest. My Naruto was that. The Rasengan ripped through his last layer of armor and into the side of his head, causing the tiniest Jinchuriki to scream in sudden, heart-stopping pain. He clenched his fist in desperation, his sand finally rising to meet and crush the first shinobi to ever hurt him twice now. However, the Rasengan exploded with a clatter of light and sound before it could. Tamari, who had apparently survived her brother's sand without incident, called out, "Gara," from somewhere behind me. She stumbled and fell to her knees as she attempted to run past me and toward her brother, maybe not completely unharmed. The Rasengan's final discharge through said brother, the source of her distress, into and through his absolute defense. My eyes widened as I saw where Naruto had sent him sprawling in near the cliff's edge as he fell boneless across the grassy plain, his face a bloody mess. When it became evident that this would not be sufficient, Gaara's armor separated from his body and sank into the ground as his sand surged across the field after him. His fall slowed, but not enough to keep him from dying. With plenty of momentum, the tiniest Jinchuriki went over the edge. He vanished after I last saw him, leaving behind one deadly jade eye and another hidden by a bloody hand. My heart skipped a beat as Naruto stood up straight after he had fallen into a crouch. I couldn't have imagined this to be what it was. The sage never promised to accompany me back. He was unable to accompany me back. He passed away. I witnessed it. Naruto turned to face me and grinned wryly as he ran a hand through his hair. My Chikudo dropped from my suddenly numb fingers as I shivered. In the ensuing silence, he said, in a steady, clear voice. Why couldn't I recall him speaking in that manner the first time? How was Th? With a grunt, his legs shot out from beneath him, bound together by a solitary strand of sand. With my heart exploding in my throat, I ran ahead. He was pulled unpredictably to the same edge its master had just crossed by the lone, nearly invisible strand that whipped him across the ground. After flipping onto his stomach, Naruto kicked wildly at the sand surrounding his legs and dug his hands into the ground. Why was he so far away? It only responded by looping tighter around him. He had already crossed the edge and was out of sight when I blinked forward in a body flicker. I blinked, and everything around me changed, becoming more clear than it had been just a second before. With the exception of Naruto, everything moved a little more slowly than before, allowing me to see every detail in agonizing detail. With blood roaring in my ears, I skidded to a stop at the cliff's edge and frantically called out to my true love. Asura. The decoy clone somewhere behind me exploded in chakra smoke, and Naruto whirled around in midair as he fell, his amazing, gorgeous blue eyes brimming with joy and disbelief as my voice and his clone's memories struck him. Then a ferocious smile spread across his lips, and tears welled up in my eyes, blurring the world. Indra, he exclaimed, saluting with his middle and index fingers raised to his headband. I'll meet you there. A grotesque hand, composed entirely of sand and as tall and wide as the Hokage Tower, then reached up to him from below. With eyes that hadn't been alive for years, Naruto winked at me. The same gasping sound, but stronger and different, rushed up my throat. I collapsed to my knees in relief as I laughed for the first time in, well, I can't remember how long. The titanic hand then closed around him, engulfing him and pulling him down to the Ichibi's caverns. It's you, isn't it? Naruto glanced up at Madara vaguely. Her renowned eyes, the result of decades of deliberate genocide against the Uzumaki, were fixed on his alone with eerie ferocity. As she straddled him, her ridiculously long hair gathered around his head, obscuring everything except her own dark features and bright purple eyes. It had an unsettling effect. And he said, "Who's me?" His lips were pursed. It hadn't been very clear. Why did it all seem so hazy? She hissed, bending closer. "Don't play dumb," she said. Idly, Naruto thought about bending over and rubbing their noses together. When her nose wasn't wrinkled up from a sneer, he thought it was cute. She said, "I can see it," as she drank it all in with ravenousness, glancing from his eyes to his lips to the curve of his jaw. "With these eyes, I can finally see. That chakra, the way it clings to you. I see." "Chakra," murmured Naruto. It was accurate, he required chakra. "Kurama?" Kurama growled, "We're out," the words echoing in his mind and dispelling some of the confusion. The words came out clipped and short. "You blew it all protecting the weaklings. It'll take me a minute to gather more." "Stall." Kurama felt uneasy. Sharply biting his lip, Naruto concentrated on the pain and collected his thoughts. He said, "Whose chakra?" "His chakra." Madara trembled, and Naruto gasped in shock at the sudden pain the movement caused. Her war fan protruded from his chest as he looked down, away from her eyes. "Yes, exactly, he was on his back for that reason." "Thanks, Kurama. That will also take time." She reached out and brushed a few hairs off his forehead, exposing the symbol underneath. "I should have realized it sooner," she said. The sound of her laughter was no less pleasant because of its bitterness. "It was right in front of me for years, but I never realized. I didn't want to realize." In that regard, she was very similar to Sasuke. She shook her head, her hair lightly grazing his cheeks, saying, "To think you'd be an Uzumaki, it's just too cruel." Admitting, "I don't understand," Naruto said. As though noticing him for the first time, Madara blinked and turned to face him. He was drawn back into the mists by the hypnotically spinning concentric circles that encircled her pupils. She traced a finger across the scars on his cheek and whispered again, "It's you, isn't it?" He shuddered. "Hashirama." With wide eyes, Naruto questioned, "What? No, that's not." Naruto grunted as the Uchiha matriarch leaned closer to him, pressing her fan an inch deeper into his chest. "Liar. I can see it. The same chakra that connected me to him, now it connects you to her." The final word was spit out like a nasty curse. "My descendant, Uchiha Sasuke," Madara uttered, frowning with her full red lips. "We were nearly identical, the four of us. The most notorious Nukenin Konoha has ever seen since myself, and you, Uzumaki Naruto, the most acclaimed hero of Konoha since Hashirama. Her eyes have the same power mine did, and you know just how similar you are to him." She blinked once, twice, and Naruto lost consciousness as she fought back tears, saying, "But he chose Konoha, and you chose her. Why did you choose her, when he didn't choose me?" she asked. "Madara." He pushed aside the woman's shivering response to his voice, which sent another sharp pain through his chest. "I didn't do you wrong," he said. He whispered, "I chose both. I didn't pick her over Konoha." "Why? Why her, and not me?" she demanded, her smoky, low voice cracking around the word. "What is it about her that I lack? I've improved in every aspect, including strength and speed. I'm more of a woman, aren't I?" Her voice broke, and Naruto took a sharp breath as a tear landed on his cheek. He struggled for words and repeated, "Madara, not expecting this, not expecting these kinds of fears, not expecting these insecurities." She leaned down and pressed her lips to his, saving him the trouble. He drew away as far as he could, which wasn't very far, making protesting noises all the while, and she finally gave in, her crimson breastplate heaving as she leaned back. Naruto jerked, flinching away from the pain of the movement in the lips of the woman who was doing her level best to end the world. She pushed her tongue past his lips, warm and eager, but he avoided its touch. Why did she look so much like Sasuke? She whispered, "You kiss like him, too." "I'm not Hashirama, and Sasuke isn't you," he declared, adding that our lives and decisions were different. That is now the past. She leaned into his palm, holding it tightly in her own, and Naruto made his body move, reaching up to cup a porcelain white cheek in his hand. This whole thing, this plan, isn't going to change that. He begged, move on, Madara. He winced as her hand closed around his, snapping it with a sharp crack. Never, yelled Madara, the earth shivering under them from the intensity of her fury. I lost him to that woman first, and now I've lost you to myself. I will not permit it. I will never permit it. Far away, someone screamed in rage, and Madara jumped off him in time to dodge a bolt of raging black flames, and the arrow pierced the earth with a diameter of more than a foot, followed a moment later by another. Avoid him! With a shriek, Sasuke shot out of the sky on Susanoo's flaming wings. With one sharp jerk, Madara tore the fan from his chest and snarled, wiping the tears from her cheeks. What? No. No, Kurama howled, and Naruto arched up as a sensation he'd only ever felt once before ripped through him in the fan's wake. Naruto. You must persevere, do not permit. Everything became very, very quiet, and he forgot Kurama's voice. While gazing up at the midnight sky, Naruto blinked slowly and breathed, his chest rising, falling, rising, falling, as a silhouette passed overhead, a tall figure he recognized but couldn't quite place. The earth shook, signaling that another person had joined him on the ground, and then he saw the face of a nervous young woman above him, screaming something at him, the stars in her blood-red eyes spinning wildly, but all he could hear was the soft pounding of his own heart. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. The name pierced the haze Kurama had left in his head, and with it came a rush of fierce affection. Naruto smiled, reaching up and covering one of her hands with his own, leaden fingers that struggled to intertwine themselves with hers. She was stunning, even as she screamed, shook him, and began to cry. The name was Sasuke. For some inexplicable reason, his throat faltered at the first syllable as he rasped, Sa. Why was he so exhausted? Where was Kurama? Naruto shook his head, hoping she would stop before she wore out her voice, but Sasuke continued to scream at him, threading her fingers through Hisa the broken ones, though they didn't hurt all that much anymore, as if his sudden deafness was a wall she could break with enough effort. Love. She never discussed her feelings, particularly with regard to them, and he knew she detested it when he discussed his own, but it felt right to say it. He closed his eyes and gave her hand the best squeeze he could with his broken, numb fingers. Thus, Uzumaki Naruto passed away in silence. Ah, you're awake. Then he looked up at the old man floating calmly in front of him, the only other presence in the vast expanse of pure white energies he'd been taken to. Naruto blinked, propped himself up on his elbows, and looked at his unmarred torso. That was fast. Kurama. With all three eyes crinkling, he grinned and said, not exactly. I would be nearer to his dad. With a furrowed brow, Naruto said, do Biju have parents? He jabbed a finger at the three-eyed man floating in midair, and a moment later, the answer struck him. Knowledge gathered from gloating, meditation, and rushed mid-battle briefings coming together to form the man who had split the 9 Biju with the eyes of a god. You are the wise one. With his silvery white hair fluttering above his head and grazing a short set of horns, the Rikudo Sennin nodded and said, and you are Uzumaki Naruto. The sage was still there when Naruto opened his eyes after pushing himself to his feet and cleaning them. Aren't you dead? Are you not? He paused and touched his chest, saying, He had recovered from worse before, hadn't he? But why was everything so hazy that he couldn't recall what had brought him here? I don't know. While you were preoccupied with the Gedo Mazo, Uchiha Madara used her war fan to pin you to the ground. When Uchiha Sasuke drove her away, she took Kurama with her. Allow me to refresh your memory, the sage said, not in an unpleasant way. Your heart stopped because of your injury and the shock of losing his chakra after so fully integrating it with yours. Naruto gazed. What? Sasuke is fighting her now, the sage told him, and she won't be around for long if you don't help her. Maybe a minute or two. She will then die with us. No, Naruto blurted, help me, and the sage arched an eyebrow. She can't die right now. Madara can't die, and if she wins, we stand to lose too much, please. After giving him some thought, the sage asked, what do you know about my children, Naruto? 6 orbs of chakra so dense that they screamed to Naruto's senses rotated slowly behind him. Your kids? With careful consideration, Naruto bit his lip and said, there were 2. They were powerful. He clenched his eyes shut and forced himself to remember, Sasuke was dying, and he was unable to recall His wrinkled lips quirked wryly as the sage said, "Their names were Indra and Asura," jolting him out of his growing panic. "My daughter and son, respectively, and both very strong, yes. Indra was a lot like your Sasuke. Deeply emotional on the inside, and more self-centered than she should have been. My spiritual energies were passed down to her, along with a variation of my eyes that you are probably familiar with." Naruto muttered, Sharingan, with a sort of disgust, and the sage laughed. "Yes. As my eldest child, she was a natural genius who surpassed even the high standards everyone had for her. Before she reached your age, she outgrew my teachings and sought greater power, which I had but was unable to give her. People worshipped her just as fervently as they worshipped me," he sighed, continuing regretfully. "Asura was different. A fool, in every sense of the word. He inherited my physical energies, an incredible vitality of chakra, but he had no control over them. He was brash, headstrong, and regularly outperformed by the people I taught. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't match his sister. A dead last." The sage bowed his head in agreement as Naruto scowled and made the connection. The sage flicked a hand, and the chakra orbs around him swirled between them, 5 orbs dancing around one. "He was much like you, when you were a child. And just like you, he grew in a way nobody expected, least of all his older sister. While Indra wholeheartedly embraced her role as my heir apparent, conducting herself as a clear superior to those who followed her, Asura refused to lord his parentage over even the lowliest man. He befriended men, women, and children through sheer force of personality, working diligently all the while to realize the full potential of the chakra I'd given him." The wise man laughed quietly. I think even he was surprised when he did. Naruto said, "Sir," in a strained tone, "I appreciate you telling me about your kids," and he obliged. "But is this going to save Sasuke?" The sage looked at him thoughtfully, his arms folded. "You know, I would have expected you to ask about saving yourself first." "I'm already dead," indicated Naruto. He sighed and rubbed his neck, saying, "And even if I had to choose, well, I'd rather she make it than me." With genuine surprise, the Rikudo Sennin blinked. "So that's why." "Huh?" The thin staff that had been floating behind him whirled around into the sage's grasp as he flicked his hand once more. "Uzumaki Naruto," he said, his voice heavy with gravity. Naruto bore his Rinnegan. "With my eyes, I can clearly see Asura's chakra clinging tightly to you." Naruto's eyes expanded as he said, "How?" Pointing to the expanse of pure white energies, the sage said, "Exactly how I have come to you here, now. A process that sent his chakra, body and soul, journeying through time and space in search of a worthy heir. Transmigration." Naruto saw a man staring back up at him in the reflection of the surface he was standing on, which rippled like water. He muttered, "Asura," and the reflection lowered its head. "But why come back? And why me?" "As I was saying," the wise man remarked with a laugh, "because all of his supporters had been friends before he became powerful. Asura had an even more loyal following than Indra when he came of age. He was strong in his own right and fervently committed to Pisa not because I wanted it, but because he wanted it for himself and all of his priceless friends." He sighed, "I passed my waning energies and dreams of peace to Asura instead of Indra, as the world had anticipated, because she did not take it well. Indra, who had looked down upon her brother her whole life, could not accept that I had chosen him as my heir instead of her. She challenged his right to be the heir to my peace, discarding my peace in the same motion by waging war against her own brother. She had never felt failure before then, and her pride could not accept the blow. And then, there were her feelings for him." "Wait, you mean feelings?" a puzzled Naruto inquired. The Rikudo Sennin gave a solemn nod. "Indra had very high standards, in all aspects of her life. Looking back on it now, I believe part of the reason she was so disappointed in Asura's inadequacy was that she wanted him to be her partner." Noticing Naruto's aghast expression, it was hard for them both. They couldn't really relate to anyone else, and the only way they could avoid the wonder and attention they received as my kids was to be with each other. Indra discovered that Asura had been everything she had always desired, as she had just not been patient enough to allow him to show Ida when he at last realized his full potential. Asura had felt the same way about his sister for similar reasons, but I had already died by the time they could have expressed it, so they had to decide between their love and my dream. They chose my dream, and it haunts them to this day, the sage said, slowly spinning his staff while his facial wrinkles deepened to reflect his sorrow. Naruto trailed off, observing his reflection's melancholy look as it observed its father. "Then Asura is doing this because he's guilty?" "Guilty," the sage admitted. "The delicate peace that my own sibling and I had established before our deaths was shattered by my children's war, and it hasn't been restored since. Even the dead are burned by that kind of failure. Since then, Asura has been restlessly moving through time and space in pursuit of a better heir to my will than himself, never sleeping a day. Indra is much the same. Naruto took a deep breath. Her too. Asura's reflection, which was his own, gave a single nod. Then where is she? Uchiha Sasuke, the wise man acknowledged. Naruto recoiled as he spoke, finding it difficult to integrate this new, terrifying information with the others. And before her, Uchiha Madara. Great, said Naruto. The last words that the Uchiha matriarch said to him then came together. Oh, great. It was the Shodai before me, wasn't it? Both father and son gave a solemn nod. In this fever dream he was undoubtedly having, Naruto threw his hands up to the sky, pleading with anyone for some sanity. Great. Perfect. So not only is it incest, but she's a double Nukenin, too. No wonder Sasuke's out of her mind with that kind of legacy. Naruto shouted. Sadly, there was only one deity present, and he didn't seem particularly willing to assist. Naruto paced back and forth to burn off some energy before realizing that Asura's reflection was following him everywhere and coming to a halt. So then what's the point of all this? He asked. The Shodai and Madara didn't do any better than your children, even with their souls along for the ride, whatever that even does. They created your village. Naruto yelled, and then Madara wiped my family out. Is that really an improvement? Perhaps not, said the wise man. Right, they didn't work. Whoever Asura and Indra transmigrated to before that obviously didn't work, and now they've chosen me and Sasuke. But what is the difference? What has Asura given me that I wouldn't have gotten myself? Nothing, said the wise man. Yet, exactly. With a sharp click, the final Uzumaki's teeth came together, yet? Yes. The sage deflected Asura's reflection by spinning his staff in one hand while skimming the surface Naruto was standing on. The man's departure somewhat relieved Naruto. There is incredible power in the souls of my children. Power beyond modern ninjutsu, forged by years of toil and war. True ninshu. Yet they have not once shared their power with another. Not even their chosen hosts. Do you know why? Naruto gave a headshake. The Rikudo Sennin faced Naruto, and the weight of his presence nearly knocked him off his feet. This was a true heavenly subjugation of what could only be an all-pervading God. All this time, through all these centuries, they have been looking for better heirs than themselves. My children chose the wrong goals to throw their lives away pursuing, and only in death did they realize that they were incapable of handling their own power. They inherited my body and soul without really earning them, and they lacked the strength and complete self-confidence necessary to control it. The third eye in his forehead glowed with skillfully controlled strength as he grinned and said, "But you're different. They couldn't finish their journeys, and so they died fools. You have a peculiar sense of foolishness that sets you apart from your predecessors, and that is what has created this alternative possibility." The 6 spheres of chakra gathered above the thin, weathered hand held out by the Rikudo Sennin, swirling and dancing around one another until they all collided at once, shivering and melting into a single mass of hyper-dense chakra. Looks like a deck of cards. Uzumaki Naruto, tell me, what arcana knowledge do you possess? Somewhere, in the sands, Gara growled, nobody makes me bleed my own blood. You have the wrong person. As I sped through thrashing tendrils and waves of chakra-laden sand, I called back, beaming broadly. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, and you're going to remember it for the rest of your life. In the midst of the most recent rush, I appeared right in my fellow Jinchuriki's blind spot and slammed a handful of spiral energy into the wall that his automatic defense threw up at the last second. 2 clones plunged through the opening and tackled Gara off his feet, and another 2 did the same to me, sparing me from a vengeful spear of sand that lurched up from the veritable sea of grains beneath me. After converting my assisted dodge into a somersault and landing within spitting distance of my opponent, I leapt to avoid another barrage of sand-based projectiles. Good. I ducked a stray whip and went on, but Naruto left and right were caught mid-high five and neatly decapitated. I rolled my eyes and made another 4. The clone on the left whooped and smacked the clone on the right's raised hand. As they hurried off to bother Gara, I told them to stay focused, guys, but it was hard to be angry at them because of the silly little smiles on their faces. I was positive that I looked giddier than all of them combined. She was here, she was with me. My Sasuke was alive. This was a serious mission, and my team was going to be in serious danger in very short order, but I couldn't help it. Accepting the Rikudo Sennin's offer to return had relieved me of the weight of innumerable deaths and hardships, but it was immediately replaced by the loss of my relationships as I knew them. Another pair of clones rushed past me to join the fight, giving me friendly punches on each shoulder as they passed, and I laughed. Now that I had one of them back, I had her back, and I wanted to dance, sing, and give the closest living thing a half-hearted hug. "Leave me alone." Gara thrashed against the clone that was currently hugging him until he passed out, wheezing. The clones dancing around him died quickly, clearly overwhelmed, while the youngest son of the cage jerked forward, a layer of his body tearing itself grotesquely from his frame to pry the clone from him. It died a second later, dragged into the seas of sand by a hand that was only about the size of a fully grown man rather than the Hokage Tower. With white, knuckled fingers gripping the bloodied side of his face, Gara took a shaky breath and said, "How do you keep touching me? How can you get past Mother?" he inquired. "How?" With a sly smile, I crouchingly shot up into the air to dodge a group of deadly sand clones, barely touching the tips of my fingers to a low hanging stalactite before using chakra to latch onto it and swinging up into a vertical crouch. "Gara, it's really easy. I've got people to protect, and a plan that everything is going according to," I yelled, my voice resonating over the continuous scrape of sand against stone. I wasn't just talking tough, either. My plan was going great, save for a minor hiccup when Sasuke yelled the name of my spiritual predecessor at the top of her lungs and Gara pulled me off the cliff before I could deliver my cool one-liner. I had Gara exactly where I wanted him, and since this was my Sasuke, I suppressed another silly laugh. I wouldn't have to worry about my team not arriving in the proper location for the final part of this disastrous mission. She would guide Sakura and Kakashi to their precise destination, so my only task was to get there. Easy, simple, cake. "People to keep safe," Gara bit out, looking up at me with more offense than when I had almost blown a hole in his head. "Liar. What have you not given yourself that you could receive from others?" Now for the tricky part. I inhaled deeply. The bloody Jinchuriki sneered, "Friendship, Gara. It's true. I've won every battle for someone else. All of my blood, sweat, tears, and every step I've taken beyond my comfort zone have been for my friends. I was nothing more than a waste on my own." With a growl, Gara pointed at me and threw a stream of sand at the ceiling. "You're a fool," she said. Well, he was not mistaken. The walls were of slick, dark stone that resisted all but the most certain of grips, rising in smooth waves that tapered off into jagged teeth at the roof of the cavern's mouth. The air tasted salty and damp, a product of the rivers still coursing in ceaselessly from the sea. The caverns were even bigger on the inside than they appeared from the cliffside, which was saying something considering how stupidly huge they looked. With a few inches to spare, I could squeeze the Hokage Mountain, possibly even a Bijua, between the cavern's highest and lowest points, and Gara was filling it with sand. "It's all part of my overall strategy. You're capable of more than this," I insisted, launching myself across the cavern's ceiling and bouncing between the stalactites, never giving the sands more than a second to track me. "You will be better than this, but not alone, not without others. Your life isn't and never will be sufficient with all the blood in the world." "What do you know?" Gara shouted, removing his left hand from his wound long enough to drop another wave of sand onto the ceiling, surrounding me on all sides. "Nothing. If it takes the blood of the entire world, starting with you, to prove my existence, then I'll take it. Susu Sabaku." In an instant, the sand rushed toward me, exploding with a thunderclap. When Gara saw that there was no blood mixed with the sand, he turned around just in time to catch two of my clones, and his automatic defense crushed them without mercy, then exploded as the two clones behind hit it with their joint Rasengan, leaving him wide open for another sucker punch. His lips twitched in the beginnings of a maniacal smile as he watched the sand pour down from the ceiling. "The solution is not to kill." I struck him in the face with another Rasengan. My heart clenched and my stomach turned when I heard the shriek that ripped through my fellow Jinchuriki's throat, but I forced myself to ignore his suffering and take the rising tackle that sent me flying again. It hurt, but he would benefit from it in the long run. When I considered it that way, it wasn't a difficult decision. Either now, in these caverns, or later, in the center of Konoha, my home. The hybrid appendage shook wildly, ebony claws of hyper. Condensed sand grinding against one another until the whole thing collapsed in on itself. But my clone's tackle saved me from the titanic clawed hand that erupted from beneath Gara and clenched around him. But it didn't launch me nearly high enough to reach another stalactite. In a hopping, skidding crouch, I struck the ground and tipped my head back to watch the writhing fountain of half-formed hands, eyes, and clones that lifted Gara 10, 20, and higher, rising in time with the steady, agonized groan that drifted past his lips, his face completely hidden by his trembling hands. the bloody grains of his second skin leaking between his fingers, and more than a dozen eyes of all sizes bobbed above him, all of them focused on me. I couldn't back down now, so I stomped down on another surge of sympathetic pain, turned, and ran for the closest vertical surface. "Hear me out, Gara," I yelled, but he didn't answer and continued to moan. To calm the sand that was still after me, I summoned a horde of clones, who leapt up onto the ceiling and ran across its uneven surface. This isn't really what you want. It's not, you know. Instead of being a weapon, you want people who will accept you for who you are. You want to be treated like a little brother by your siblings. You desire love. It's clearly visible on your face. Gara got down on his knees in the pillar of still, rising sand and rasped, "You don't know anything. You don't know me," he said. Before I was able to stop myself with a stalactite, I flipped over a stray lash of sand, the world spinning around me. I gritted my teeth and forced every last bit of my emotion up to my throat, hoping he would see and understand. "Gara, I recognize you. I am aware that you need someone to rescue you from the gloom that your village abandoned you to. You require a companion. You need me." I slapped my hand to my chest and covered the cavern's ceiling with clones and my chakra. "Well, I'm here now," I added, frantically reaching out to him, "and I'm ready to pull you out of this life. Have faith." With each word, Gara's voice grew louder and the sands more agitated. "I don't know you," he said. "I don't need your friendship. I am not in need of love, on my own. I'm powerful. No one is necessary for me." The hateful, bloody snarl on his face was exposed when he tore his hands from his face and jabbed them up at me, palms flat. I let out a sigh. "Taiju. Rasengan." All of the clones simultaneously pushed off the ceiling, screamed spiraling chakra spheres in their hands, and landed on my first best friend. I waited for the technique to finish, closing my eyes. After nearly a minute, I was struck by a new presence that was similar to Gara in many aspects but more vile and hateful than any of my fellow Jinchuriki could have ever been. I assumed this was to be expected since Shukaku had had centuries to despise people. Finally free, Shukaku was almost at eye level with me, but I might as well have been dead from all the attention he gave me. With his head thrown back and his arms spread wide, Shukaku was the epitome of ecstasy. "The weakest of the 9 Biju bellowed," he said, and when I opened my eyes, I saw that the pillar of sand had doubled or tripled in size to accommodate Gara's demonic ward. The sand literally rolled off Shukaku in waves as I fell silently hundreds of feet below the ceiling, and he was so engrossed in his sudden freedom that he didn't even notice the impact. 12 years. He roared with laughter, breaking a few stalactites that happened to be hanging too close. "Too long, tortoise years, and your fool son didn't even get the chance to use me in your petty war." It turned out that this was part of the plan, too, but it was not the part one had ever wanted to use. I had no tools that I had become so accustomed to, that I had taken for granted as a sage, and I had nothing that could stop Shukaku, much less suppress him, except Gara himself, who was obviously not up to the task as he was. As much as I wanted to beat the sense back into Gara as soon as physically possible, there was only so much I could do at this point. Even though I detested admitting it to myself, this mission was about more than Gara. It was about protecting Sakura from the horrors that had almost destroyed her after Kakashi's death. It was about getting to know Kakashi this time, and it was about saving the life of an innocent civilian, no matter how fucking stupid he was. And now, for heaven's sake, it was about returning to my Sasuke and giving her a hug that would make her fall deeply in love. There was nothing I could do but rile up Jinchuriki and Biju and leave them to rage themselves dry as far away from civilization as physically possible because I couldn't die here yet, but I also couldn't defeat Gara without the toads, without Kurama, and without nature. Shukaku finally laughed so hard that he looked down his muzzle at the Konoha nin who had set him free. "You, brat," he bellowed, "are you the one WHO installed my angry host?" "That's me," I said, gathering chakra for the biggest group of shadow clones I've created since my transmigration. If I want even the remotest chance of escaping this place alive, every single one will matter. The caverns had been the best option overall. They had eliminated the other members of Gara's team. They were big enough to hold anything up to and including his complete metamorphosis, and they gave me a different route to the final part of my mission. However, the Ichibi and I were still confined to a cave. I don't know why I'd expected Gara to be as reasonable as I was used to him being, but I had, and now all I could do was leave him to his sorrow and Shukaku's wrath and hope he returned to Suna after he finally burned out. If only I wasn't a scrawny little genin. If only, if only, if only. Shukaku was just too much, too soon for me. "Some friend I am," I muttered, feeling genuinely exhausted and in a good mood. Shukaku amusedly said, "Indeed, his poisonous yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. I appreciate the gesture. Your death will be the first and the most painless. A single tail rose from the pool of sand gathered beneath it, and the caverns trembled menacingly as the enormous tanuki shifted its weight, jerking from side to side, stretching out after years imprisoned behind bars, brushing the cavern's roof and snapping off the stalactites one by one, some of them wider around than a tree trunk, as if they were merely slivers of ice. After Shukaku explained, one swift smack, like swatting an insect, I closed my eyes, felt the biju for a moment, and prepared for my mad dash by rippling chakra beneath my skin. The Ichibi was by far the weakest of the 9 biju in terms of raw destructive power. If you were faced 1 on .1 biju against biju, or 2 on .1, or even 3 on .1, the Kyuubi could easily crush him. The point is that the Ichibi couldn't compete with the Kyuubi, with whom I had grown up, fought, and fused my chakra. He was undoubtedly the weakest of the 9, but he still burned to my senses like the sun. There was so much natural energy concentrated in one location, imprisoned in this one cavern, and tainted by so much negativity as so much anger and hatred, and underneath that, Herta that had transformed what ought to have been one of the most exquisite tenketsu in the world into a throbbing sore that was painful to look at. This was wrong. I had seen it before, I felt it in my bones. The natural energies of such a negative existence could only cause destruction. If I left now, countless living things would perish, including trees, plants, animals, and organisms that relied solely on Mother Nature's calming energies. Those same gentle hands would wipe them out, warped and perverted by the negative emotions of a bitter biju. I understood that Shukaku was too dangerous, too unbalanced, and that something was required to counterbalance his natural energies. Or someone. Oh, I'm an idiot. Mother Nature whispered in my ear, "Wake up," and after 3 excruciating weeks of blindness, I opened my eyes after feeling her touch on my brow for a brief moment before it struck me, a playful prod to the center of my forehead. Shukaku shifted back in shock and grunted, "What the?" as natural energy poured into the cavern, washing past sand and crashing against the walls as it came hurtling toward me. I threw back my head and laughed. I had spent weeks bitching and complaining about my physical condition, and it had been my mind that was preventing me from moving forward all along. I had become so sure of my ability to control the world's chakra that I had forgotten why I was a sage, what a sage was, how they were created, and why they were even here. Equilibrium. In the same instant, I felt Shukaku swing his tail around to crush me. I also felt a bird caring for its young in a nest hundreds of feet above me, Gara's siblings and their sensei trembling at the cavern's entrance, a colony of insects running deeper into the caves, and my team racing through the forests above in anticipation of an ambush. But above all, I felt the Teresa above, below, and all around Maya with bark, roots, and innumerable leaves. In an instant, Shukaku's tail traveled the entire length of the cavern, and at the same time, I summoned all the trees Mother Nature had to offer. Perish! Shukaku's eyes widened, then he let out a painful cry as the hand crushed his tail to sandy pulp, and as I clenched my fist, a giant hand composed of dozens and dozens of interwoven branches tore itself free of the earth and caught the Ichibi's tail at its widest point, stopping it in its tracks. "Saw," I uttered as I planted my feet and beckoned the others. A moment later, another hand exploded into the air on the opposite side of me, its long, spindly fingers spreading wide, and soon after, thicker branches and roots wound up its wrist and enveloped its fingers, making them thicker, firmer. The hand slammed itself flat against the earth, the groan of shifting wood mingling with Shukaku's pained wails as the massive construct strained to leverage the rest of itself from the earth. The cavern rocked as my creation dragged itself into the light, and then the second hand pressed itself to the ground alongside the first. As my awareness and Mother Nature's ink continued to expand from that same, singular point on my brow where Konoha's symbol sat, I crossed my legs, slipped into slow, steady breaths, and focused on the Ichibi as the fool broke through the earth beneath me and I fell back into the bed of frenzied leaves and branches that made up its hair as it rose. The arms, rippling with muscles derived from tree trunks and thick roots taken from the forests above, followed by the legs, each thickly layered with wooden bulk, took their place after the head and torso. The fool then tore its feet from the ground, left and then right, and stood for the first time, once more. Shukaku stared at my wooden colossus and took another step back, concealing his quickly reforming tail behind him. "What is this? WHO are you? Could I get a hand?" I asked, extending my hands. Mother Nature gave me 2 because she was such a giving woman. The gauntlets Sasuke had given me were quickly pried from my hands, falling over the edge of the fool's head and into the streams below, and I quickly made a note to apologize for that the next time I saw her. The thick branches of the fool's hair nearest to me twisted and bent, latching onto my wrists and winding up my hands. The gauntlets were nice, too, not too thick, not too thin, just the way I liked them, expertly crafted with the finest materials the Uchiha clan could buy, and any shinobi would have been happy to have them. It had been very considerate of her to give them to me, especially now that I knew she understood their significance, and I appreciated it more than words could express. Ultimately, though, they were simply unable to compete with my wood. I clenched and unclenched my hands, my teeth flashing in a smile, as the ends of my new old gauntlets snapped off halfway down my forearms, leaving my hands covered fingertip to fingertip by the best chakra conductor known to man. Oh, that is far superior. Well, I told the voice in my head, you're not Kurama. With deep, smooth, and unmistakably amused words, they responded, not as such, saying, I'd be closer to his brother. Asura, I said, you took your sweet time. He hummed in agreement, and I crossed my arms and leaned back into the fool. Just as my father could speak to you only after your death, so too was I restricted by my transmigration. I said, I'm more alive than dead, pointing out that the Shukaku's tail and his temper had both completed reforming. I'm more dead than alive, too. Time and space don't seem to mind, Asura said, followed by what might have been the strangest sensation I've ever felt. My ancestor's soul leaned over my shoulder, though I wasn't sure how I knew he was standing behind me, and placed his hands on my shoulders. Now, don't mind me. We have tasks to complete. I briefly contemplated disagreeing. Just a second. The fool roared, knocking Gara's siblings off their feet with the force of it, and the tangle of branches, bark, and leaves that made up its chest lit up with a vivid green light as it slammed its clenched fists together and opened its mouth to reveal countless jagged lengths of sharpened bark as it looked up at the Ichibi. My heart beat in time with the world's, and the fool's heart beat in time with mine. Who am I? Who am I? I'm the last man standing, I yelled, jumping to my feet and clenching my fists. I am the one who will bring the world together, break the chain of hatred, and restore the peace of old man Rikudo. Mother Nature's favorite Tenketsu, the ninth wonder of the world, and the heir to all that matters. I pumped my fists, and the fool did the same, and I let out a loud howl and smiled broadly. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, motherfucker. Unexpectedly, I found myself sprinting through the forest like a woman under a spell, with Hitaki and Sakura following closely behind and the client slung over Hitaki's back, heading straight for the battle that had previously killed the Genin. I was running, pointedly ignoring my Naruto, the danger he was in, and the fear that he might have lost too much strength to complete the task he had begun. Then the world changed in the next instant. I was just in time to witness the change as I blinked, instantly summoning my Sharingan to validate my frantic hopes. A dizzying clamor of every hue under Amaterasu's sun erupted as chakra rushed past us, with every last bit of it racing back to the caverns to which he had been dragged. His chakra. As before, as the first time, Naruto gave nature his chakra in exchange for nature receiving his own. Hitaki muttered, "Oh my," as he stepped up next to me and looked around with his bare Sharingan. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, the world's chakra was changing, but it was changing nonetheless, and I felt another burden lift as I realized that it was starting to resemble Naruto in a faintly orange way, just as I remembered. I assume you also have an explanation for this? Hitaki inquired, just as enthralled as I was. Grinning, I said, he's back.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.